I think I can speak for localization in general here.
Mm.
Like, we're all doing this because we love the stuff, we love the storytelling, and we want as many people as possible to enjoy the original. What's great about the original, and that's sort of always my guiding light is like, don't break anything. Like, that's the rule, right? Like, try not to break something. That's maintain what's great about the original. And then you have all those other considerations to make and all those other decisions, and we're not going to make the right decision every time. That's going to happen. Right. It's amazing that the right decision ever gets made.
Yes,
that's how I feel.
Because translation is impossible.
Welcome back to the State of the Arc podcast. My name is Mike.
My name is Kason.
And we are thrilled to be joined once again by Alexander O. Smith, game writer, former Japanese to English game translator, who has worked on many of our favorites, such as Final Fantasy X, 12, Vagrant Story, and Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney. Thank you for joining us again. We have had so many long conversations with you. I know this is a large time commitment, so thank you for being willing to do
that. Thank you guys for having me on. I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Oh, we have too. It's just been phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. And for many, many years, I had wanted to talk to you, so this is great. So we have now done 2 episodes, I guess technically 3, if you go all the way back to the Unicorn Overlord episode we did, that is sort of tackling this controversial, sort of sensitive issue of Japanese to English game translation and whether or not the industry currently is being faithful enough to what the original writers intended in their works, and whether or not we have maybe some cultural erasure or appropriation going on in the translation. So if you have not seen the previous episodes, I do suggest that you go watch that. There's a lot that we'll be talking about today that is going to be furthering that conversation or in response to things that have come up within those. So it's probably a good idea to start there. But Kason and I did an episode last week responding to an ex-user, Zago, and some of his criticisms of the industry. And he wrote us about a 16-page document that went into details about why he feels the way he does about things and where his criticism is coming from. And I feel like we made a lot of headway as far as furthering this conversation without it getting into a lot of the toxic territory that it tends to get into. And so we want to continue that moving forward. So we wanted to bring Alex back on, since he was with us on the episode we did before the one we covered with Zago. So now, Alex, that you have seen our episode from last week, and of course, a lot of the feedback that you received on the episode we did together, we have a whole document that you've kind of drawn up here about a lot of things that you want to go into to clarify and further that conversation. But is there sort of maybe a tone setter that we can draw on here, something that you'd like to say to get this kicked off in response to the feedback that you've received and in response to Zago's arguments from that document?
Yeah. And also, just to repeat what you said a moment ago about this being part of a larger conversation, and to thank you for starting that conversation and continuing it. I feel like you guys are doing a really good job of reaching out and trying to represent as many of the viewpoints here in this discussion. I think it's a really important discussion to have. A lot of people feel very strongly about it, and it's my sneaking suspicion that a lot of us actually agree a lot more than it may appear on the surface of things. It's always the case, right?
Yes. I think that's definitely the case. Yeah, most of them.
Yeah, and a lot of us, I think, could be actually very powerful allies.
Yeah.
To each other.
Yeah.
Provided that we're meeting each other in a place of respect, and and I'm not talking about like safe spaces. I feel like, we need to have this sort of this vibrant, this energetic discussion is great, but there's a way to do it and there's a way to not do it. And And I'm very happy to actually be, responding to the podcast that you guys did a week ago as well, because I feel like you touched on a lot of these issues, like what does it mean to have a discourse, a constructive discourse, and a constructive conversation, and some do's and don'ts. And then I guess in the course of what we go through here today, some of it is going to sound a bit like I'm jumping on one side.
Yeah.
And some of it might even sound like I'm, like punching down, because obviously I've been in this industry a very long time. I know a lot of people in the industry, and there are things that have happened just even in the last year with regards to sort of, critiques of localization, and from years ago as well, that where I feel like there are bits of the narrative that have gone off in bad directions, and I would like to correct those.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would also really like to get into the weeds to say, okay, here's a critique. Where is this, where does this ring true, and where is this maybe misunderstanding the process?
Right.
And a lot of this is just possible because of, I mean, I think the whole reason we're having this talk, there's a couple of reasons, but the immediate reason we're having this talk is because you guys reached out to a ex-user. Sounds like we're talking about a drug.
I know. X is such a terrible name. That's why I still call it Twitter for the most part.
Twitter. Thank you. All right, great.
An ex-abuser. That's funny.
Right. We were playing a BBS, and so you reached out to Zagos and said, hey, it sounds like you've been part of this online discussion. There's been some fallout. There's been some damage done in both directions, to be fair. Right. And then he reached out to you with this document.
Yeah.
And that's a great step forward. Thanks to Zagos for putting in that time and providing that sort of reasoned approach to this. But that was only possible because you guys reached out as well. And so I feel like we're getting there, but this is maybe not the easiest way to get there. And there was damage done. So anyway, today, like I love to take some time both to just talk about some of the big ideas, but also go a little bit into the weeds and look at some of the places where to give advice, and maybe it'll come across a bit as tough love in some cases, because I've been where I'm presuming Zagos is.
Me too.
If you want to see someone working out their stuff with an audience of millions, play Final Fantasy X in the English.
How old were you when you translated that?
That's a great question. I'm going to say early 20s.
Early 20s.
Early 20s. Wow.
What year did it come out?
2001?
Yeah, 2001 was the year it came out. Yeah. So maybe we can start there. I mean, like, you had so many years in the industry and you've come so far since then. I mean, how do you look back on that time, as a young man? Maybe you'd even call it a kid, maybe, and view, your work from that time.
That's wow. Yeah. It's funny because I have gone back and looked at some things, and there are projects where I can look at them and say, this I did the best I could possibly have done at the time. And some places it worked out better than others, to be honest. Vagrant Story worked out better, I think, than say like Final Fantasy X, and it has nothing to do with the other people on the project. And again, like I need to give like a shout out and apology to my co-translator on 10, Aziz Hinoshta, because he worked tirelessly on the script as did I. And then when it came time to record, and I feel like we got into this in our first episode, but ask follow-up questions if you need more details. When it got into recording, it turned out that we actually needed to rewrite a lot of it because it was not properly matching time codes, and that was something we just weren't aware of. So I was put in a situation of having to rewrite a lot of the voice script, or the bulk of the voice script. And so now, his work, I'm stamping on other people's work. I'm saying on a lot of other people's work at that point.
Yeah.
And I fully accept the blame for mistakes that were made. But And that's working in, I don't want to completely derail the conversation too, but and we can maybe come back to this at the end, but there were things that happened during, FF10 and in the recording and the stresses that I was under. And I'm glad that I was in my early 20s, because if I was in my early 30s or any later, it would have killed me easily. And I bore scars from that experience that I was dealing with for decades afterwards. And, maybe I can insert a note here, like, be nice to people online. If you see an activist translator who's doing, I'm sorry, I'm using like a ridiculous straw man here, but if you see an activist translator, if they exist out there, like doing crazy stuff, be aware that you don't know what they're going through. And if you see somebody on Twitter saying crazy stuff, and inciting sort of online bullying and that sort of thing, you need to address those things, but also we don't know what they're going through. And as a case in point, I was dealing with the fallout from Final Fantasy X. I left Square. I left my job, the first job I ever had. I went through a lot of stuff. Topic for another day, perhaps. But I also did some of what I feel is the best work in my career after that. Phoenix Wright, Final Fantasy 12. And I was doing all of that stuff while dealing with all of this, crap. So it may, from the outside, look like, Alex had his shit together. Not the case.
So are you saying that you had a lot of like sharp criticism and like people upset with your work on FF10? Is that?
No, not too bad. It was really just the stress of, not sleeping for 2 months, 3 months.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. This was common. I mean, I've done several retrospectives on those old Square games, and that was almost a universal thing that I found in every single one of them was workers, devs being like, I slept underneath my desk. And like I had like heart issues and had to be hospitalized.
Became temporarily blind.
Losing hair, like this sort of thing.
What's wild about it is that a lot of the Japanese devs, it goes one of two ways. Either they're just like, I'm never doing that again. That was freaking ridiculous. Or they're like looking back on it with fondness. Like, oh, that was so fun how we slept at the office for like 3 months. And oh man, those were good times. What?
Stockholm Syndrome.
Interesting. I mostly just hear that from the Japanese developers when they talk about how great the times were when they were working themselves to death. I don't hear that as much from the other developers.
I don't know if you ever knew Ko Arai at Square. Did you remember that name? So he worked on Xenogears, and he has a really fun quote. Well, fun's probably not the right word, but he basically was asked about the process of working on Xenogears, and he called it hell. Like, I can't believe we actually got through that process. Like, it was like one of the worst experiences of my life. Yeah. And so I feel for you. I feel for you as being a part of kind of like that sort of old school crunch. And I know crunch is still a huge part of the industry. It's still a huge problem. Yeah. But I think it was probably worse then. I think so. And maybe more
from
accepted.
What I've read. Yeah.
Absolutely. Than it is now. People speak out against this a lot more now, and I think policies are changing for the better, hopefully, probably slower than they should. But
I did the video before about karoshi, the working till you die kind of
right
in Japan.
The mentality in Japan. Okay, so I don't want to, like you said, I don't want to derail too much, but I just wanted to clarify. So that's the hell you were kind of going through.
I'm talking about hospitalization, not criticism online.
That's tough. That's tough.
Dang, man.
And the same thing, like for FF12, I did sleep under the desk for a lot of that. I lost the ability to use my hands at one point just because of like typing so much.
Whoa.
And that's something also I struggled with. Thank God for voice recognition when it came out. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff that went on, and honestly, I do think back on it fondly. I totally get that. There's a certain joy in being so dedicated to something. I definitely did that on Vagrant Story too. I was, it was 24/7, but I was even younger then, and that's an important thing. Yeah, and that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Wow, that's
Anyway.
wild.
Yeah.
What
well,
was I doing back then?
yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind is, no matter how upset or angry something that you read online might make you, or it might create certain assumptions about this person and the kind of person they are. That's what this whole exercise was about for me.
Right.
Was I feel like maybe we had made some assumptions about Zagos in our original, Unicorn Overlord video. And I was like, you know what? I talk all the time about not making assumptions. I need to stop doing that. Let me reach out and talk to the guy. And so we're just trying to promote that as much as possible here. So keep that in mind. Thank you for bringing that up. Now, why don't we move on to some of your responses to Zagos' document, if we can. You had some notes here, and I wanted to give you a chance to maybe go over your specific responses to him.
Yeah, thanks. And by notes, I am going to be checking. I've got my notes here as well. I haven't written out everything that I'm going to say. These are just sort of like topics that I feel like would be great to have out there in the open, and we might just acknowledge them and move on, or we can get into them as you guys like.
Sure.
But there was a couple things that Zagos brought up in his letter that I feel like are some of these are like, yeah, this is useful. We can talk about this, and some of them are like, maybe we should rethink this. And there's a lot of rabbit holes to fall down here too. So I'll trust in you guys to keep us moving along.
Sure, I can do that.
But so like the general from the letter, and this is also will be familiar to anybody who has watched last week's episode with Mike and Kason going over these things together in a very thoughtful way. And thanks again for that. But the I guess the main things I wanted to touch on just specifically from Zagos' letter were this idea of the equivalent experience idea. I think that's really important. I'll just list them up and then I'll circle back.
Okay.
The idea of the dry translation.
Yeah.
The straight as a way of understanding changes made in localization. The idea of, and this also gets back to the sort of equivalent experience, but the idea of meeting the gamer halfway, bringing them into the space between the Japanese work and the one version of the localized work, basically.
Right.
And then this is probably the most loaded term in this whole discussion, but the idea of censorship.
Yeah.
Right.
What does that mean? Who's censoring whom? At what point? And I think that one is best saved for the last, because it does kind of then segue into a lot of other discussions about, what are we doing when we localize, and what's the point of all this anyway? And what are some constructive ways that people who don't like the status quo can add in a constructive, sort of fruitful way to the discussion and maybe move the needle?
Yeah.
Cool. Or add options.
Yeah.
Great.
Just really quickly, I think that of all of those topics, the one that jumps out to me, maybe this can be where we launch, is the censorship thing. And you mentioning it being a loaded word. I agree with that. And there's a certain part of me that understands the sentiment that was coming from Zagos. And again, the general sentiment of it, which is what I was talking about last week, I agree with, but how are we properly diagnosing whether that's really what's happening? Because you can look at this as, okay, Nintendo of Japan has reached out to its Western counterparts and said, hey, advise us on whether or not content that we're putting into this game is going to be perhaps, raise people's eyebrows or seen as offensive in these other cultures. You can look at that as self-censorship, or you can look at that as collaboration. It's not this idea that there's one auteur here for this game, especially with games. Games are very much, and it's true with film too, very much a collaborative art. This is not just one person's, there's not one writer. And a lot of times even the person who is credited as being the origin of the story is not necessarily the person writing the scenes. They have a team that sort of do that, right? And so there's lots and lots of voices that go into creating a game, and a lot of different people adding their opinions and their thoughts to that. And so at what at what place are we arbitrarily drawing the line that these are the auteurs because they're the Japanese dev team, and anybody else invited in to collaborate on that process is seen as some kind of overbearing Western department that's, forcing our values onto them. This is more difficult for me to really work out. At what point is it collaboration, and at what point is it censorship?
Right.
And I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that. Maybe I can pass that to you, Alex.
I mean, I think that's the heart of the issue here, right?
Yeah.
And I know that a common, and again, this is maybe gets back to the ways of having this conversation versus ways that we shouldn't have this conversation, and that you touched on, which is the best way to have this conversation is for everybody to show up face to face and talk about it.
Yeah.
And there's an inherent imbalance online when a lot of the people, the game creators you're talking about, the localizers, these are real people. We're all real people, but these are people with names that you can look them up. You can dox them if you wanted to do that. There are things. These are people that are on the public record, and a lot of the criticism by the nature of the internet comes from anonymous people, and that is a good way. And and we you can get into the issue of like, okay, but there should be room for whistleblowers. Yeah, I agree.
Right.
There should be places for people to make noise without recrimination, because sometimes that's the only way to get a message out there. But I'd argue that that's a good way to, like, if here's the castle and you want the attention of the king in the castle, and so you bang pots together, like that can work. You can get the attention of the king and castle. But that doesn't start a conversation. And most of the time, that just means that they're going to lower the drawbridge or raise the drawbridge. Sorry, lower the portcullis and say, somebody shut that guy up, right?
Right.
Whereas if you actually want to get change, a petition works much better.
Right.
And then the ultimate form of that is you show up and you have a discussion face to face. I realize that's a journey there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like people like Zagos are on that journey, and I look forward to a place where we can all just sort of meet on that sort of even playing ground and say, this is me, that's you. Let's talk about the ideas.
Yeah, there was one ex-user I saw today who he kind of have a thread in response to some of this, and I'll summarize the general sentiment of what he was saying was, these guys have talked about how important it is to listen to different points of view, yet it feels like they're being very dismissive in terms of talking to us about chilling out, so to speak, right? But what I don't think they're recognizing is how long and how difficult it has been for us to feel like we're heard at all. Like we feel like we're constantly dismissed. Nobody takes us seriously. And at some point, like you get angry enough, like when is that justified? When is being more extreme kind of the only way you can have your voice heard? And so first of all, I wanted to respond to that by saying, I feel like we tried to say that, but it was right at the very beginning of the episode. But I just want to restate that I understand that too. And there's been plenty of examples of much more important issues, particularly in this country, where that sentiment is totally understood by me. It's like we have tried being polite and protesting in the quote unquote direct way, and nobody listens to us anyways. And so like I get the urge or the frustration or this idea that like I have to start banging the pots or being a little bit more rude about this in order to get someone to listen. But I agree overall with what you're saying is that getting the attention maybe is what you do. But then at that point, that kind of like super aggressive or dismissive rhetoric is not going to get you very far once the attention has been grabbed, right? Like, and I tried to kind of allude to this earlier in the conversation, but again, it's the way we talk to each other. If you're going to approach somebody and you're just mudslinging and throwing insults at them, they're much less likely to listen to you and much more likely to feel threatened and get defensive.
Yeah.
Right? So there needs to be a strategy in place, I feel like. And maybe just in mentioning that, and maybe in mentioning the Operation Rainfall campaign that we talked about, maybe that's going to spark some ideas in some people and say, hey, how can we organize better? How can we present this message, maybe with still the same passion, maybe with still the same amount of like, hey, this is important. You guys need to listen to us, some urgency to that, without taking a tone that will make them drop the portcullis, like he's saying, make them just like get more defensive, put the guards on the wall and not let you in.
As it pertains to like when it's proper to use violence, this is something, or to use violence when it's proper to whatever, to push things further than the polite box
way,
that you're allowed to be in. And I've never been able to come up with a good answer for that.
It's hard.
Because there are too many counterexamples, and there are too many things that happen both ways that have brought us to the point where we are in the first place, that I don't know that there's really a hard rule for that.
Yeah.
Basically, but if you want access to the levers of power, being friendly to those who wield them might be as good an option as storming the castle and taking them for yourself.
Yeah, I'll put it this way. Because maybe we're veering off into a direction here where we might not be the best people to necessarily give a good answer for, like, especially larger issues than Japanese to English localization. But from my own experience, so this is something I can draw on for sure and say this works. We made that video with Alex the first time we sat down with him, and Zakogdo did a huge thread where he assumed we were acting in bad faith. He, said they posted my thing again. It seems like they're kind of like after me. All these things that I looked at that and I go, that's not how I feel.
Right.
And I could have either made a video response like we tend to see online where I start like arguing with him and calling him dumb and you're wrong and stupid for this and that.
The E-drama.
Or I just invite him to sit down and talk. And then, but he watched today the episode that went out and he thanked me.
Oh, good.
He thanked me for that. He's like, you have no idea that, like, how nice it is that to have somebody like actually genuinely listen to us. Us on this side of this debate. We feel so dismissed all the time.
That means a lot, actually, to hear that, because I feel like we were still kind of hard on
and he was
him
totally
in that episode.
Okay with the criticism. Yeah.
It doesn't take that much effort.
No.
To reach people who want to be heard.
Yes.
It doesn't. And I was actually wondering if he was maybe going to be more upset, or maybe just that it was just going to keep going on.
No. He was super nervous about it.
Good to hear. And that does kind of, that might be even like a teaching moment for me, where it's like people who want to be heard legitimately and genuinely, and they aren't just in it for the clicks or whatever.
Right.
They even if there is a lot of criticism levied during a response, they just appreciate a genuine response that actually takes their problem seriously.
Yes. That's all it takes. And that's
not that much.
That's at the crux of what I was trying to say at the beginning of the last episode.
Yeah.
If people feel dismissed, if they come to you with a concern and all you ever do is turn them away and tell them how stupid that concern is, it's going to turn into the toxicity we're having now.
Totally, yeah.
And so I wanted to acknowledge that user who was putting this into the thread they put out today. We do recognize that. And that's the entire reason why we wanted to continue this conversation and invite Zakogdo to do this. And so this is important to all of us, Alex included. And it's part of the reason why he's back to have this conversation again.
Yeah.
And so if there's anything that appears to be, like he's saying, punching down or like, being too harsh on people, please take that in the spirit in which it's being given and which he has stated. He's trying to do it as more of a tough love kind of thing, not as, he's not mocking. He's not trying to, regress this conversation.
Right.
Right.
They say that for nations or great competing powers that you're either talking or you're fighting.
Yeah.
Right. It's either diplomacy or war. And those are really the two options.
Yeah.
And so the more talking, the better.
That's what I feel. Now, we kind of got off a little bit from some of those topics that you had brought up as wanting to respond to in his document. Is there one of those that jumped out to you that maybe you wanted to address first?
That was an excellent diversion, and you guys fixed the internet, so congratulations. And I'm being facetious, obviously, but I completely appreciate this, and I really appreciate you guys reaching out and like taking that time. Yeah. And I appreciate, people like Zago kind of, engaging in an honest way. And actually, you mentioned at the very top, like, was there anything in the reactions to the first interview that I gave that bothered me? And there really wasn't that much. There were a couple of people calling out old mistakes and that sort of thing. I'd love to address those because I love talking about my own dirty laundry. Like, it's one of my favorite topics.
I'd love to also talk about the stuff that you did right, by the way. Maybe at some point we can get into like the 99% of stuff you did that was good and right.
Yeah. That would be nice too. The one flavor of comment and that did bother me, and I saw this, and my assumption here is that these are mostly people that are not followers of your show, but people that heard about it, jumped in just to say a couple things.
Probably. Yeah.
And those are the people who jumped in to say, "Nope, hard pass." I'm not going to listen.
Not even going to try to engage with it.
That's your choice, dude. But also at the same time, like, if you really feel passionate about these issues and you really want to make change, absolutely engaging. Please listen to these podcasts. Listen to the one that you and Kaysen did last week. Listen to the first one that I did. Listen to this one. Engage. Send ideas. I might even jump into the comments on this YouTube video.
Oh boy! Nice. That's dangerous territory.
And I can read, so I definitely do see those things. And it's interesting, and I like moving things in a constructive way, and hopefully,
good.
We're going to get a bit into the weeds soon, I promise. But also want to just keep an eye out for opportunities to like open the floor for other people's comments and other people's ideas. You said, was there anything in the discussion that you just gave that stuck in my mind? There's a couple points that I have a bit more context about. One is the idea of the sort of the auteur, and the idea that there's this creation happening on the Japanese side, and then maybe that stops, or that's getting stopped somehow in the process of bringing it to the West. And you're absolutely right when you think about sort of auteurs. I immediately think of, and I'm not speaking with any like privileged information, just as a fan and a gamer. You think of like the Kojimas and the Nomuras of the world, right? And there's this image of them as these sort of auteurs that are like orchestrating everything, and to a degree they are, and they definitely have opinions about the story, but they're not writing the words.
Right.
They might write like one or two words, or they might have a couple lines and a couple things that like exemplify the characters in the story that they want to tell, but that's being farmed out to a lot of people.
Yeah.
And those people, everybody is in the middle of this dialogue of what's the story they want to tell, the person that's directing wants to tell. What's the story that I personally can tell? What are the tools that I have to tell that story? And who am I telling that story to? And everybody's going to have a different opinion about this. And then we would have a lot to talk about if we were just talking about Japanese games being sold in Japan and being played by Japanese gamers.
Yeah.
There's tons of, if you want to talk about censorship, there's tons of self-censorship within Japanese companies, as well there should be, when they're just thinking about their own internal audience, and it has nothing to do with Western values. And this is another thing. Like anyone who's really interested in really getting into the weeds on this sort of the idea of cultural colonization. Should a great place to start would be Edward Said's book Orientalism. It's something like 8,000 pages long. Pause this, go read it. We'll wait.
Great.
It's something I actually had to read in college.
Oh, really? That sounds like a college book.
It's totally a college book. But it did change the way that I see the world.
Oh, good.
And it changed the way that I watched like James Bond movies and Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and and Rudyard Kipling's Kim, and all of these things where you start getting into this idea of like, what is the other? What is this other culture? Yeah. What's our role in interacting with that? And there's so much to unpack here. And echoing what Mike said, we're probably not the best people to talk about this. Well, speaking for me, at least.
I feel that way too.
But if you are worried, and I'm talking to the people who commented nope on the first video, if you're worried about a Western person or like they say a white guy in Japan telling the Japanese what to do, if that's something that concerns you, you should absolutely reach out to me, because I'm one of a few people that Japanese developers come to when they have questions about how should we present this to the West. I'm actively involved in that conversation, even though I'm now a part, away from localization per se for the last 7 years or so. I'm still actively part of that conversation. And if you've got a nuance that I'm missing, like, talk to me about it. Let's collaborate. Because I fully admit that I don't know what's going on. And I'm also, I'm a human, and I've got my own stories that I want to tell. And I've got my own times when I check my ego at the door, which is something that Zago said in his document. I think that's a really important part of being a translator or a localizer and being part of this cultural conversation. So jumping to another thing that you mentioned, there's so much to unpack about all these things.
I know, right?
But that idea about like the sort of overbearing censorship from the West, where Japan is now forced to like jump through hoops in order to sell stuff. That idea, there's a couple problems with that idea. One is often, I would say far more often, the case is not that the West is overbearing. The West is downstream, and you've got Japan making something, and then it just gets shuffled downhill, and they're not even paying attention to what happens, or they don't care deeply about what happens. And there's very little communication between the two. And so there's room there for the industry to like tighten up the screws and like get the conversation moving better, for sure. But that can cause a lot of like, when you're on the outside looking in, you're like, oh, it's going this way, and it's totally not. And this is something that I run into all the time. And I'm not speaking about like localizers or game devs or anybody in particular. It's more about like the way that companies work, where often, decisions aren't made by the guy at the bottom. They're made way above, right?
Yeah.
And the decisions made by way above are not often the most informed decisions. They can be. But one thing I've learned, if I've learned anything in the last 30 some odd years in this industry, oh wow, yeah, it's like 32 years now.
Congrats.
Thanks.
Thanks.
I'm alive.
Nice.
If I've learned anything in those 32 years, it's that if you see something that looks like enemy action, 99% of the time it's incompetence.
I've heard this. Never
I
attribute.
really like that.
Yeah.
That rings so true to me.
Well, they say don't attribute to malice what could be attributed to incompetence.
Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And I see it so freaking much, even, I shouldn't say this, I probably shouldn't, but within the company I work with, like I see it all the freaking time.
Yeah. And the thing is, and this is something, and this actually gets back to stuff that we talked about in our first episode, where I might have harshed a bit on Japanese game writers, or come across as I was harshing on Japanese game writers. It's like this lesser level of writing.
Yeah, it was me. It was me that brought that up.
Sorry for not handling it properly. That's not the case, obviously. And also, when we talk about incompetence, we're not talking about individual incompetence. Like almost all the time, we're not talking about individual incompetence. It's not like there's some dumbass there causing all these problems.
Right.
way that companies work.
Yes,
The process is in place.
It's inefficient. It's just inefficient.
That's okay. I want to clarify. That's more what I was speaking to.
Okay,
too.
good, yeah.
I wasn't trying to call out individuals from my company.
So it's the incompetence of the group.
Yes,
which is mostly because
this was
of
a big part of our conversation several podcasts back about my hatred of the entity known as the corporation.
Yes, the body.
The larger it becomes, the more this becomes true.
Yes, absolutely.
Because there are more and more people to manage and more places where this kind of lack of systems in place to account for problems that could arise becomes more and more evident.
Yeah.
Like this is why I just believe so strongly that smaller dev teams, smaller companies, like breaking up the giant corporations will make them more efficient at what they do. Because in these giant companies, like there's just so many times where you're spinning your wheels as me, an individual working there, thinking, how on earth has this not moved forward yet? Why are we still in approvals for this? Like this person is still not aware that they need to be looking at it. And why should they anyways? This doesn't really concern their department. You know, there's just all these inefficiencies. And I think that's more what you're talking about, right?
That is. And I have, like, I'm very thankful to say that in the other parts of my career, I have actually had the pleasure of working with companies who are doing really interesting things to fix these problems and keeping these small teams without like pitching them all against each other. Like you might have, like, you know, Microsoft was famous for back in the day. You know, for better or for worse. And a lot of that stuff I can't talk about because NDAs and, you know, that sort of thing.
Right.
But there are people trying to fix those problems. And it's often the people, and this is really, it's like individuals who are trying to fix these problems with the way that corporations and governments, and we're way out of our league here. So moving on to a new topic. Again,
maybe to recap very quickly what we had said, you had sort of opposed Zagos' like premise of the equivalent experience, saying you have to change it to offer the equivalent experience
in order,
because the Japanese audience didn't have a foreign experience. So in order for it to feel equivalent, you have to make it feel more Western.
The idea of Americans meeting the Japanese halfway was absent in the Japanese experience, which means that it's not equivalent. Yeah.
So what is your response to that point that Kaysen had made?
Well, and it's not a point. It's more me saying you can't have it all. You can't do everything. You can't have do it the exact same way that it's written and also equivalent experience. They're both so important. We need to have them both. That's more or less my point. But
what do you think about that?
I see my thumbs up here.
Right there.
It's not, you can't have it all.
No.
You don't get to have it all. And there's a lot of reasons why that's the case. We can be a little more specific than, you know, that's life. There's economic reasons. People say, hey, well, why, you know, if you're going to do this sort of like bold translation where you're taking something from the Japanese and you're like making the language more flowery, you're taking it in this sort of what feels like a very new direction. Can we also release a straight up translation? Like, you know, something that's more true to the original and that sort of thing. And I would say, of course you could, but it's important to know that the money isn't there. And the money is barely there for the localization we get.
You know, it's pretty new. It's pretty new for like all these different languages that are getting localizations now. I mean, it's such a new thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we talked about, maybe it was offline, we talked about agencies and the role of agencies, and we can talk about that again too.
Yeah, let's do it.
Because it's interesting, just in a sort of what do you call it? An industry structural kind of way.
Right. So you know, on that topic, if we're talking about the big companies, the Nintendos of the world, they have internal localization teams. But there's a lot of smaller like Atlases and companies like that might not, particularly for like all the other languages, Spanish, French, German, you know, Portuguese. So they rely on agencies to sort of fill the gaps there and make those localizations, right?
Yeah. And that is a double-edged sword, I guess you can say. There are great things that agencies do, and I think that the intent and the sort of the ideal form of the agency has been realized to some extent, and that's a great thing. But then there's also the sort of downside of the agency approach. I did a little bit of agency work, actually, like Phoenix Wright was done through an agency.
Oh, nice.
And a lot of other stuff that I don't even remember was probably also done through agencies. But for the most part, I was working as, I guess, what you'd call like a boutique translation, where I'm outside the company, but I know the people and I know the developers involved enough, and I have direct contact with them, and they choose my team because they want a specific kind of localization, a specific kind of attention to the original and to the creation, the co-creation of a new product.
You know, that's a really interesting point. I think that's really important to like actually hammer on a little bit more. You were chosen, your agency was chosen specifically because of the previous work and your approach to it. That in and of itself suggests that's the intention of the original Japanese team. They want you for the way you do it. That's not your agency going in there and forcing your approach on something else. They're very much aware of your approach, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I have had a boutique translation. You can call it an agency.
Oh,
let's call it a boutique, just so we've got a different word.
Okay.
It works like an agency though, where you've got, but it's not on the scale of the keywords and the pull to win. You know, those very large localization agencies who also do a lot of other stuff. They game creation services. There's a word for that genre of things, and we were in part doing that, but we were doing it with a very small team. That was essentially myself and Joe Reeder as the main people. Joe Reeder is my co-translator on FF12. He also worked on, he was one of the main translators at Square on FF10-2, along with another translator, Brian Gray.
Oh, yes.
Oh, gotcha.
So, yeah.
So Brian worked on Final Fantasy X too?
He was on 10-2. He was one of the translators.
I did not know that. That's good to know. So just I guess a bit of a teaser for what we're going to talk about later. Brian Gray was the lead translator on Eiyuden Chronicle, which is one of the games highly, highly criticized by Zach Hogdo and some others. So we're going to get into that. We're going to show some actual examples from that a little later. But it's good to know that he was on 10-2. I did not realize that.
Yep. And what were we talking about? Co-creation. Oh, right. Describing agencies versus, So you've got these very large agencies, and generally how this works, and it's getting better and better and better every year. But generally the way this works is a company that does not have the resources to do internal localization for a title. And this is true even of the really big companies. They may have an internal team, but they've got a lot of stuff going on. And especially if they're doing publishing like Square Enix also does, they just don't have the bandwidth. And so they will often outsource to agencies, these large agencies. And the large agency, the good thing is that you're getting a certain level of quality because you know the agency's work. And the bad thing is there's a lack of transparency that you don't know who's actually doing the work many times. Or do you have the time to care a lot of times? So it works out, for both people. But you can get into this situation where there is this disconnect between what localization is doing and what the dev team is doing, and it's all self-inflicted. It's not nobody, the localization isn't going rogue and trying to do something crazy. And there is communication, and the agencies help this happen with like it's QA tables. There's a word for it. I think I actually wrote it down here somewhere because it was a new term for me, but it came up in your talk, and I realized it's something that I've been part of as well.
Right.
It'll come up.
Well, while you're looking for that, I think this is again hitting the point home that a lot of times the assumption is that this is some sort of malevolent or like ill-conceived, intention on behalf of one party or the other, whereas the reality is structural organizational incompetence. There's just not a procedure. There's not a structure or any kind of what would you call it? What's the word I'm looking for?
Agenda?
Yeah, well, there's not a system within the company in place to do this effectively, right? So you have the team internally at Nintendo, for instance, so overwhelmed by their workload, their bandwidth is totally freaking maxed out, that we don't even have a procedure in place for when the agency comes in to make sure that these steps are being followed for the accuracy of this translation or whatever. It's like they're kind of just given a job and not given a lot of direction on it, and they just do the best they can. But these are, and then this is something, again, having worked in a larger company, that oftentimes come to the forefront. Things get slipped through the cracks, so to speak. There's negative feedback, and they go, "Oh, we don't have a system in place for that. Let's create one." Right. Like this is sort of a learning process over time. Something that maybe even the company doesn't even anticipate as being a problem in the first place. And then, here comes the negative feedback. We need a system for this. And so it seems to me like this is just, for the most part, examples of not having the right systems in place, the right procedures that would address these particular set of criticisms that these critics like Zagos and others have online. And so they're assuming bad faith. They're assuming rogue translation, when this could be much more easily explained and makes way more sense to me as being the company just they're not doing this the right way because they've maxed out their bandwidth and they have nobody overseeing this the correct way. Would that be fair?
Yes, but there's a caveat, or I think that there's an arc here to understand.
Okay.
Not to name check the podcast, but you start off, there's a historical arc here. And what you're describing, like that state of affairs, it has definitely been true, more true in the past than it is now.
Okay.
And that is thanks to the work of these agencies in a large part, but also the internal teams of the companies and boutique translators like I was, and we'll also circle back to that later. But the idea is, in the beginning, when I first joined Squaresoft, the US branch, and then transferred to Square way before the Annex merger in 1999, I was joining a translation department that didn't have its own department. We were part of IT, actually. They're just systematically. So talk about like a system that's not ready.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
No idea. And Richard Honeywood was, again, at this time, they're working tirelessly to make, like, hey, what if we had a localization department, that sort of thing?
Right.
What if we had a manager who understood localization and wasn't an IT manager? So anyway, this is Dark Ages is what I'm talking about, right?
Yes.
And this is where you get the all your base are belong to us.
Oh yeah.
Classic.
We love that. We love that line.
We did a whole remix.
Yeah, and and again, I'm not like saying like that's old and horrible, so we should get rid of it. I kind of love it too, and that's a kind of a point that I would like to work in a little later on too. I know there's a whole lot to cover here.
Yeah, there's like an endearing element to some of it.
Yeah, exactly, and like I want that too, but we're all greedy. The point I wanted to make about the arc here is that you're starting off in this. In the Dark Ages, where localization is literally this black box. The Japanese dev team makes their game. After the game's completely finished, because we're not doing simultaneous release, the game's completely finished, sometimes years after the game's finished. They throw it into a black box. English comes out the other side, and that's the end of the story. And by the time that they're throwing it into the black box, the original team is on to the next game. They might even be on to the next game after the next game.
Especially back in the day,
Yeah, nobody's there, right? Nobody's watching. There's nobody to talk to. If somebody in the black box of localization is like, "Hey, what did you guys mean when you did this?" Oh, that guy left the company.
Yeah, that's a great point
That's
too.
right.
The turnover in
Right.
all of this, right? Like,
Yeah.
you might be working on a game and you want to reach out to one of the writers on it. That writer's been gone for 8 months or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's pretty
Or,
funny.
hey, can we adjust this menu because you guys had there was one character space for every element, fire, water.
Right, because
It's
that's
just one character,
Yeah.
but we can't do it in one character in English, or let alone German, who's like even longer than English, right?
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, the guy who did that is now working for this other company.
Mhm.
And maybe we'll find a tech person. And this is where people like Richard Honeywood, who also have programming skills, were making like, here's a mock-up of a like subtitle display so that we can translate something and see how it looks on the screen.
Yeah.
Without having to wait for a compiler, that kind of thing. So, especially when we're talking historically about early localization, like the barriers to making something good were so great and so unanticipated. And that's what I talk about when I'm talking about Final Fantasy X, like the first fully voiced game for Square. Nobody had any idea on any side what they were doing.
Right. You had to learn it as you go. Yeah.
You learn it as you go. And sometimes that meant rewriting the whole damn thing. And it's a lot. It's a lot. And that's a whole nother, like, if you guys want to do a deep dive into F10, I think my NDA with them expired a bazillion years ago.
Oh, that'd be great.
And there's a lot of like fun and maybe informative stories, but that's all the dark ages, right?
Yeah.
And now in an ideal world, you've got agencies who completely understand what's going on, and they're using these it's basically like low Q&A sheets where and I've been on the writer's side of this too, where you're producing this material, you farm it out to the agency, who then handles all the different languages that are going on and the voice recordings and all that sort of stuff. And then the translators come back and they're like, hey, what does this mean? What does this mean? What's the context for this? And this is something, maybe we mentioned this like in an offline conversation at some point, where you would be, as the writer, you have to engage with the localization. And if they say a question like, okay, here's this yes and no thing. It's a yes and no toggle in the game, in the menu. What is that? Where's that being used? And then you look it up and you're like, oh, it's an answer to the question of like, are you going to school or whatever? And then the answer and the options in English are like yes and no. Right. But language like Japanese naturally wouldn't say height or ie in that thing.
Right,
They would say ikimasu, ikimasen.
Right, yeah.
So because the way that you negate a traditionally the way that you negate a question or affirm a question is not saying yes or no, but by echoing the verb that's being used. Like, are you going? Not going.
Yeah.
Are you going? Yes, going. Right. And so that kind of context, if they don't have it, they're going to mistranslate. There's the risk that they'll mistranslate that yes and no. Lo and behold, lots of times, like a Western game will use this sort of yes no toggle, and they'll use it all over the board. And so it's like, it's answering that "are you going to school" question, but it's also answering like, do you want to equip this sword, or that sort of thing.
Ikimasho.
Yeah, I'm going to school. Like,
that's funny.
0 cents, right? So there's a lot of like even just really, really technical stuff here, and we're not talking about like creation or authorship or any of those problems. There's all these little things that are going on, and the agencies are doing much better at that. And they're also, I think, doing much better at connecting the people who are actually on the ground doing translation with development, either if it's a direct connection or they're getting more information from dev, they're getting videos, they're getting interviews with the developers. And something that I cannot stress enough is that the people doing the localization, who are at the very bottom of this stream, they're in it because they love this material.
Are you telling me they don't get paid many millions of dollars for their work? Is that what you're telling me?
Royalties for translators. Can we talk about that?
Oh yeah, I was
would
actually
love
going
to
to
talk
ask you about
about
that
that.
because you mentioned 10 and your NDA's over, and I'm like, 10's been remade a couple times. Like, what did they just use your translation, right? I mean,
Of course, yeah. There's no royalties for translators.
So you don't. Okay, so it's a they no.
In the game industry. Yeah, sorry, that was a loaded. That was a
I was like, yeah, let's talk about it. No, they do not get it.
Yeah, and that's a universal no.
Well, I don't know if you're an employee or if you're hired and paid for the work. I guess you'd have to negotiate the royalties, and if you're not in a position to negotiate them because a lot of the agencies are kind of in a race to the bottom in terms of price, that's just royalties are just out of the question.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mentioned this earlier at some point, but this is still an immature industry, and this is part of the story of that arc.
Right.
Where what Mike was saying about that not being a connection and the sort of separation, that was definitely a thing. It's getting better, but there's this lack of sort of an industry wide. There's no SAG, there's no Writers Guild.
Yeah, that's right. The unions.
There's no union that's sort of protecting people and helping them negotiate. So really, the only thing that we have to rely on, the power structure here is the agencies. So, hope that they're doing the right thing.
Yeah. It's hard to unionize international.
Yeah, I was gonna say this being
tough.
a global industry, how hard is that?
Yeah.
As
A
being
million.
part of
That's how hard. 1 million. 1 million hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just to quickly circle back to the distinction I was trying to make between what I was doing and an agency.
Oh yeah.
What I've done, and there's other groups that do this too, this sort of boutique approach where there's transparency to a client. They know who's going to be working on the game, and they choose those people based on earlier work.
Right.
And the only reason we're able to do this is because we're very selective about the kind of things that we work on.
Okay.
And we're also not in a race to the bottom. And in fact, if anyone contacts our agency and says, hey, we're doing bidding, I say, oh, use the other people. They win.
Yeah, that's not your game.
Just use the people, it's fine.
Yeah, that's something in business called the red velvet rope policy, which I love, which is you as a company, you only let certain clients in. You're the one choosing the clients. They're not choosing you.
It's a club. Your company's a club. Yeah.
That's where you want to be as a business.
Yeah, and also, I think for real creative reasons too. Like we don't want to be part of a team that isn't interested in collaborating and
I see.
is interested in co-creation to an extent. And there's room for that. There's room for not co-creating. It's great. It's just not what my company was doing.
Okay, so because you mentioned the word co-creation, that is a word that makes some of the sensitive people around this conversation cringe. Like co-creation. I thought I was buying that dude's game. You're telling me that you're co-creating it with them? Like, who do you think you are to co-create the game that the guy I thought made it is? Anyways, what would you say to that?
Let's start at the top. The guy that you thought made it didn't make it.
Right. There's like 100 people.
There's a lot of people that made the game. Right. Yeah. So that we got that.
So the translators are the 101th person.
Yeah, exactly.
But they're all co-creating together. Ah, beautiful. I like your response. That's good.
I like it. Move on to the next topic.
Are we done? Goodness.
Well, I think it's actually
you know what? Hold on.
A little bit into the weeds. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, there is let's say Tetsuya Nomura is like, hey, make a model based on my drawing. He draws something cool, shows it to somebody, and they're like, oh, sick, I make a model. And it's not exactly what Nomura had in mind. He's like, yeah, it's pretty good, but it's what the artist did. And it's put it in the game. It's good enough, right? That was an act of co-creation. And it's one that you're likely not to be upset about because you'll never know that Nomura wasn't that happy with the look of this particular model, but they had to make 100 models, and that was one, and that's what the guy made. And there you go. It is what it is. You just never hear about that. And there's probably stories like that for every single position in video game making, where even story, all kinds of things, where the director's it's not exactly what I had in mind, but let's go with it anyways. Right? Exactly. You've got other considerations, money, deadlines, time, all kinds of things. That I'm sure that the director, producer has made these compromises with every single department and every single asset within the game. Maybe not every single one, but a lot of them. And the translators is just kind of the end of the line one that you notice more, because now games ship with both Japanese voices and English voices. And so you can listen to the Japanese voice and read the English, and then you're like, that's not what he said. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, the translator's a co-creator. He shouldn't be, right? But so is the modeler, so is everybody. Like, you're not getting a game made by one person.
Yeah.
You're getting a collaboration made by 100 people. And the translators are some of those 100 people.
Well, and how much, and maybe this is my more pointed question on this, how much of it is a collaboration in which, the Japanese dev team has invited you for the sake of collaborating. Hey, we want you to take some liberties with this script and whatnot. And how much of that is, like you're saying, there's a deadline here. This is the best we've got. It's good enough. Let's get it out the door. Is my question even making sense? Like,
yeah, everything's making too much sense.
Okay.
First of all, case in fantastic summary of the issue, drawing a line between localization or a single localizer and the rest of the project is a very arbitrary place to draw a line.
Exactly. Yeah.
And something that I've been thinking about a lot late at night since we started this conversation is like, where do you draw, thinking about it from the perspective of somebody who's receiving this localized product and saying something's wrong here. The battle has come to them in a sense, but where do you draw that battle line? If you've got something to say about it, where do you take that? Where do you take that feeling?
Right.
And where's the most effective? And this is something I don't have an answer for this.
Right.
I know that there's a more effective place than localization. I don't think the localizers are the droids you're looking for here. Because they are really, they're the 101st person on this long chain of back and forth. That started even before the chain started. I've heard countless stories of Japanese developers, these auteurs, who they have a crystallized version of the game they want to make. And by the time that they get through pre-production and funding and getting the thing, they're not making that game.
We are so used to talking about that. The Xeno games, my goodness, Tetsuya Takahashi has had the hardest time making the game he wants to make. It was so hard for him.
We used to harp on this all the time about Square Enix in particular. About how early they would announce their games before the game was really even in development. This is especially true of Final Fantasy 13.
15 and 13.
Like, they announced these projects, this whole
Fabula
Nova Crystallis trilogy thing. Like, before the games were even remotely in production. They made little cutscene movies with some character designs and
I wonder
things
if some
in them.
of that had to do with fundraising.
But it's like the
price
game
stuff.
was by no means ready to be shown yet.
And it wouldn't be for 6 years.
The development process in almost every case, like Alex is saying, starts with these grand ideas and all this cool concept.
And they get
then they realize, I can't do that. It's too expensive. It would take too long. We don't have the experience on the team or whatever reason. We're going to now have to make compromises here. Cut this idea to get this into a place where there's actually a path forward.
So we can actually finish
the thing. And so I was always an advocate for don't announce the game until the game is ready to be released that year.
Nintendo does this now,
Yeah.
And Elder Scrolls as well. They do a good job.
Skyrim did this.
Yeah, they announced it a month before.
But then
the game
Elder
dropped.
Scrolls 6, they announced freaking 10 years ago.
You're right.
They created the same problem.
Those poor guys.
So I think that has a lot to do with what you're saying, Alex, is there's already so many compromises that have been made way before we even get to this point.
Well, you know what, though? We also haven't touched on sometimes Nomura's like, hey, can you make me a dragon? There's going to be a dragon at this part. And then the guy makes a dragon, and Nomura's like, that's not what I had in mind. It's better. That's so cool. Dope, dude. Put that in the game. Put that in the game. Let's do it. Right? The collaborative, it's not just compromise. It's not what I wanted. Sometimes it's like, oh, that's actually better than what I had in mind.
You had a better idea than I did.
And so you welcome the collaborative co-creation, right? Sometimes it's actually results in a better product.
Do you have any
I'm
stories?
just bringing both the negative and the positive
I would love
here.
this. Do you have a story where that happened, where the Japanese creators liked your idea better?
Yeah, and I don't want to put words in people's mouths,
Right.
but just speaking from the stuff that I've directly experienced, and also it's as like a disclaimer, I've been extremely lucky in my career, in terms of getting into a position where creators did reach out specifically to me,
Yeah.
because they wanted to work with me, and I truly believe that that's the way. That's how you kind of tell the good guys from the bad guys, in terms of like how they see the act of creation. And I can say, like, without reservation, that Matsuno is one of the good guys in this sense.
Yeah.
Where what he is doing all down the line is finding people that he feels, and again, I'm putting words in his mouth, so apologies to Matsuno-san if I'm getting any of this wrong, but I feel like I'm also like trying to put this in the best light possible as well. But it's that the idea is, you hire the people that you want to work with because you see something in them that you don't have.
Right.
And from previous collaboration, and I follow this exact same thing when I'm working, like Joe Reeder. Yeah, let's talk about me instead of talking about somebody else. When I started work on Final Fantasy 12, Matsuno reached out to me years before it actually started, and said, "Hey, I liked working on Vagrant Story with you. Do you want to work on FF12?" And I'm like, "Great!" And I had plans of actually moving back to the States. I'm like, I'll finish this one last game.
One last game.
Fast forward like 7 years later, as these things go. And I'm still working on it. But the thing he said is like, it's going to be a big game. You probably can't do it by yourself. You need somebody. And I just worked on Final Fantasy X-2 with Brian Gray and Joseph Reeder, who were the translators they were in-house translators. And I was, again, house, wrong word. I was
third party.
Well, no, you decide whether it's the wrong word or not. Nice. I was outsourced. I was an outsourced. I was an external agent at this point. But they brought me back on 10-2 to because I was the only one in the company, literally, that had any experience with writing ADR scripts. And this is something that I learned trial by fire on Final Fantasy X.
Yeah.
And that's the writing to lip flaps. And we talked about that in the last episode. And if you guys want to get in the weeds, I could do 10 hours right now talking about lip flaps.
About ADR. I've had the
ADR,
challenge of translating for that. Yeah.
Yeah. I got examples. I got stories. I got whatever.
That'd be great.
That's a preview.
We
for
are
a future
eventually
episode.
going to do Final Fantasy 12 as an analysis.
Yeah.
We'll definitely have to have you on to talk about like dev history for that or something.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. You mentioned that last time, and sorry, quick aside here, but I'd love to do that. I probably don't have time to like relitigate the game or
Sure.
the game.
Sure.
But I'd love to, if you guys like record a series and then I get to watch that, like I watch you guys going into it because I love your deep dives.
Thanks.
And then have me on at the end. And I'll just like add in my own little.
That'd be great. That'd be great.
Awesome.
Yeah. Maybe even because we always start with the dev history episode at the beginning. So maybe we could have you on the first to give us like insider information about like what was going on.
Whatever works.
And then at the end you could come on and give just like, overall analysis once the whole story's finished. But that'd be great.
That'd be so much fun. I love that.
That'd be awesome.
For some games. What were we talking about?
We were talking about ADR and
choosing collaborators and ADR and all that stuff. Yeah. So in FF10-2, I had already left the company, but they brought me back because I was the only one in that sphere that had ever done ADR writing, which is, the rewriting to lip flaps and also to sound lengths, because the way that things work then and often still work now because of the way that Unity works and those sort of things is, if you've got a Japanese sound file that's like, we talking frames usually, it's like 30 frames a second, but so you've got like a sound file that's like 45 frames, a second and a half or so. The English file also has to fit in that space, which caused all kinds of weirdness on Final Fantasy X. We didn't know what we were doing. It's amazing that it is as good as it is.
Okay, let me ask you something real quick, because this is crazy if true. You're telling me that you have a Japanese voice actor record a line that is 45 frames long to insert here. So the way that the program is working, you're saying the English one has to be exactly the same length as the Japanese version to work.
Bingo.
Jesus Christ. That is
yeah.
unbelievable. Like,
Yeah.
I can't even imagine what a nightmare that would be.
Like
Like,
you can't.
oh my gosh. Like,
Yeah.
and people are sitting here talking about like complaining about what differences may be from like what they said this in Japanese. And it's like, you don't even have any idea how hard it was to not only make that match, but then that has to be exactly the same frame count as the Japanese audio.
Yeah. I mean, and I got this from the Japanese side too. After the thing, they're like, why we make this game all Hollywood? You know, why are we? Sorry, I didn't mean to like do pigeon English there. Why are we making this game all Hollywood? You know, why are we? And this is like months after the recording's done, and I'm like, dude, this game has been on a journey you know nothing about.
Yeah,
and I'm glad that we're now, you know, we're litigating some choices that we can still make here. You know, now that you've decided to check in. I'm not talking about like directors and stuff. I'm talking about like, you know, people that were sort of like on the outside of the project who are then coming in and going like, what happened here? You know, there's like oversight from various different directions.
Yeah.
And then, you know, and that whole idea of like, and I get the same vibes, and I definitely feel the same thing when I see stuff online where people are, you know, jumping into localization. And in defense of the Zagos of the world, a lot of people get this. They actually get it. And a lot of the discourse that I've seen online in the wake of like some of the translations that I've done, where people are like, well, really, you know, arigato, I love you, really. A lot of people come in and they're like, no, like this is pretty good, and here's the reasons why. And I'm like, oh wow, they actually kind of get it. So there are people who get it out there. I see you, I love you. Keep participating in the conversation, and also like let's keep talking about this kind of stuff. So yeah, to go back to those frames things. Kason.
Yeah.
How many frames do you need to say the word height in Japanese?
Height, 4, 6, 5, 4 or 5, 6.
Yeah, so like half a second is 15 frames.
Yeah, but I think it's even shorter than that.
Height, pretty damn short.
Height.
Yeah,
it's got a it's not really a glottal stop, but it's got a hard end on the end of it.
Yeah.
So
it just ends. I would guess maybe 5 or 6 frames. Like you could do that very quickly, but
you can totally do it in 5 or 6 frames.
Yeah.
If you're lucky, you get like a 12 frame height.
Okay.
Well, that's not even that. It's height.
Hi. Yeah. Height. If you have like a kid responding. Hi.
Okay.
Yeah.
How many frames does it take to say yes?
Yes.
A lot longer than that.
Well, the S needs to draw out. You can't you can sort of stop it, but it's harder. And yes. Yeah. Longer, maybe possibly somewhere
I
like
would
double.
guess more like 18 frames on that one.
You think 18?
Yeah.
At minimum. Yeah.
If you're lucky, the trailing S, you hear when that trailing S gets cut off.
Yes.
Oh, yes, you do.
Okay, and you hear when it gets
I want to say really quick, a lot of my work in my career has been in audio engineering.
Yeah,
and this is just like giving me vicarious freaking
like
stress.
PTSD.
I'm like my heart rate is rising. Like this is so unacceptable to be like the requirement for this is unbelievable. Like that raises my blood pressure. Holy crap.
Moving forward from those experiences to a very small degree on FF10-2, but to a larger degree on FF12, where I was involved on a project for like 5 years or so before it even started, and had plenty of time and plenty of knowledge to preemptively go to the sound and say, hey, here's a huge problem coming down the road. Let's fix it. And oftentimes, I know there's a lot of different ways that games like trigger sound now, and there's a lot more flexibility with that. We were still dealing with memory issues.
Mm-hmm.
Now, usually you worry about performance issues.
Right.
There's too much going on. It lowers performance. That's a problem. But back in the day, it was a lot of it was memory issues. Like you couldn't have a 13 frame yes in place of a 6 frame height. Right. Because you would blow up the memory that was being used in that scene, and it would crash.
Because that makes perfect sense. Actually,
or
if it was tested,
everything gets out of sync. Everything gets out of sync.
Yes,
like all kinds of stuff. It's a QA nightmare.
Oh, I'm literally like just like freaking out right now. I hate everything about what you're saying. This would be horrible.
This is me in a hotel room. With
Well,
a VHS
now the
at the age of
context,
21 or whatever.
the context as to why you felt like this would have killed you in your 30s is making sense to me.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
This is completely justified hearing this. Again, coming from the world of audio engineering and sound design, I can't even imagine how stressful that and horrible that would be and annoying.
It's fascinating how unique English is in that regard, because I'm thinking of everything else. Like in Korean, you can say ne or ne. In Spanish, you can say si. You say da. In Russian, you can say ya. In Swedish, you can say oui. In French, but in English, it's yes.
Yes,
Like it's just English. It's
Yes.
just English.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
There are cheats, and of course, FF10 was my first time out the gate, and I was learning on the job. There are a lot of cheats you can use. This is a whole nother podcast. How do you do ADR? And hopefully it's a podcast or hopefully it's an issue that just doesn't come up that much, because we have a lot of like automated lip flaps. AI is helping a lot there.
Oh yeah.
For better or worse. But there's been machine lip flap stuff.
Yeah.
And whatever. That's a whole nother conversation.
What about the difference between, like, in Japan, they're on PAL, right? So it's 25 frames per second for there.
Yeah.
And then shipping it over to America, it's 30.
30.
But they're like, they would need to re-render things, and
I
do
don't
they?
think that was the case by FF10.
No,
because we were already. My memory is really. I don't have memory of this clearly, but I feel like we had already left PAL behind. Maybe there's a European issue with PAL.
Oh, okay.
But like, it was NTSC is the other.
It's the 30.
Yeah,
PAL
I
is
feel
25.
like there was a tech shift around there that obviated the need to like go to those different formats. But yes, that was a huge deal in the 90s.
Yeah.
But you just like, there's some real buried trauma there that you just accessed, and I don't. I'll have to unpack that later.
Okay.
But actually the point that I wanted to get to was and to kind of like not pay lip service, but to kind of go into some of the things that critics of the localization process might take issue with in that realm of censorship, or the idea of censorship, or the idea of co-creation. Just to like give you a couple examples across the board, and this isn't meant to be comprehensive, but dev team or a game comes to the localization team and says, hey, we're working on a bunch of like body gestures for our game. Is anything in here going to be offensive to foreign gamers? Right. So this is a Japanese team concerned about their audience. They don't want to be needlessly offensive.
There you go. Yeah.
If they wanted to be offensive, that's a whole different conversation. Like there's room for that too, right? And they would also come to us for that too, because like, hey, we want to be offensive. We want to piss people off. What should we do? Are we doing it right? Right. Like that's a conversation too. I don't think I've had that particular one, but it wouldn't surprise me. But this one, so this is specific. They come up and they're like, hey, so we've got these guys and they all play the sports game in the game, right? There's a game that they play within the game, right? And these players, like when they come out and they're ready to play, they do a guts pose. And guts is like, let's go, right?
Yeah, the arm up.
But they're like, hey, we worked on some early animations. Here's the guts pose. And the guy goes like this, puts out his arm and he goes like this.
Oh gosh! Was that a?
He's like, yeah, let's do it. Let's go. Let's play the game. And we're all just like, oh shit. Like, how much money did you put into this, and how, And so, like, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about censorship, right? It's the game devs did not want, their star player of this game, which I'm not naming for no good reason, to say up yours to the world.
Up yours, yeah.
Right?
That's so
all they wanted to do was have him go, oh, we're psyched about this. Like, let's do it, right?
Yeah.
And we're helping them not make that mistake. And there's famous examples of this from all kinds of media, like the peace sign versus the reverse, in Australia. Mm-hmm. And all of those things that you need to be aware of when you're thinking about your audience. And it's also just to like get rid of a misconception. it's not just about like Japan dealing with the rest of the world. Japan worries about its own audience, its own internal audience. There's a lot of like negotiation. There is my friend Matt Alt has a podcast. He's an author, and he recently did a blog piece about reverse censorship, where when Japan imports games from the West, there's actually a much heavier hand in censorship than they have exporting to us.
Really?
Like The Witcher, the sex scenes, like cut. You can't show genitalia in Japanese media.
Is that a ratings thing or? Oh,
It's
I
not a
see
ratings
what you
thing.
mean.
It's like a national law, isn't
That's
it?
right.
It's a
That's
national
right.
law. Yeah.
It's like a pornography law. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not, I mean, there are ratings in Japan too, and that's also another concern. And this is something, in Japan, as in the West, as we as a society become more aware of minority issues and become more aware of the effect that like our discourse has on again, and we're getting a little bit out of our territory, at least I am here. But there are a growing list of words in Japanese that you are no longer allowed to say online.
A growing list, huh?
A growing list, yeah. And they add to it every once in a while, right?
Okay.
And these are, you could watch an Ultraman show from the 60s, and the entire show will hinge around the use of a word that you can no longer use.
Wow.
And so these are not like, this is like censoring the word crap, basically.
Right.
For a good reason, though. I mean, I won't go into the whole thing because that's another topic for the discussion. But it's not that, it's not that Japan is over here kind of, and this is, again, like read Orientalism, but it's not like Japan is over here as this like crystal palace creating, sui generis, these like amazing things. And then America comes in and says, well, if you're going to sell that, they can't smoke, they can't drink, and they can't have sex. Sorry.
Right.
It's just the way that we work. And then Japan's like, oh, okay, I guess we'll tone it down for you. Sorry. That sort of thing, which I feel like is what a lot of people see. And they're like, censorship, and like, oh, they covered up the bikinis, or, that kind of thing.
Right.
And it's all part of this conversation. And it's not like the last thing it is like localizers as some sort of like culture warriors coming in and enforcing their will. They don't have the status to do that. I know, I am one, or was one.
Right.
Like we don't have that kind of power.
Yeah.
And nor is it like, a purely West versus East thing. It doesn't work that way. It's, everybody's creating and they're thinking about an audience, and there are different rules for different kinds of media. That's just the way it is. There's different rules for games and movies and novels. And some of the critique that I saw for like, talking about why do you have to change a game localization so much? But you don't ever hear anybody talking about that for literature. And it's like, it's a totally different ball game. There's a different threshold to entry. There's a different expectation of the reader. Again, like there's like 3 podcasts here.
Real quick, are books less? Would the localization for books be less? Would that be more of what people would consider a direct translation compared to video games?
Depends on the book. I've translated a lot of books. I've translated 50, 40 novels, I want to say. Some of them were novels, and some of them were light novels. No offense to light novels, but just like fewer words and,
smaller,
less heady material, less sort of like a literary bent to them.
Okay.
Let's get into the weeds very slightly on this. And I have some audience participation. One of the things that I want to talk about is gender roles.
Okay.
And this is kind of an interesting topic. And this is, again, something that comes up a lot. When is it okay to preserve the gender roles as depicted in a source material as is in the target material? And when is it maybe not okay? This is a huge conversation,
right?
And I won't attempt to even, encapsulate most of it. I'll just talk about one specific example where I had to make a choice, and this is Higashino Keigo novel, or I guess Keigo Higashino in the West. I forget the exact one. I did about 5 of his, things like The Devotion of Suspect X was the first one. And these are murder mystery novels. They're meant as entertainment. There is some sort of literary affectation to them. There's definitely a voice to the writing.
Yeah.
But a lot of it is entertainment and who done it and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah.
So it's got that weight behind it. And then there's scenes in like this Japanese police office where a character will be ordering around one of the office girls, as they're called, and getting her to make coffee, and then maybe saying something disparaging of like the female police officer, right? And so you read that from the Western context, like a modern Western context, and I think of a few things. I think of Mad Men, which is a historical document.
Okay.
And one that's purely made in the West. And I think about sort of modern murder mysteries and what they expect. And then I also think about this idea of like, we're bringing this work from Japan to America. What do we bring with it? And what's important to the author? And there's so many things to consider, and I'll try to like just pinpoint this one issue here. The idea is if you're trying to create an equivalent experience between reading the book in Japanese as a Japanese citizen or Japanese speaker and reading the book in English as an English speaker, if you hit something in the book that makes you raise your eyebrow and say, wow, this guy's a misogynist, because you're seeing it from this Western perspective, that is a raised eyebrow that the original reader didn't have. The Japanese reader, because they're used to a certain degree of this. It's changing rapidly in Japan as well. And so then the question is, okay, as the translator, as the interlocutor between all this, do I want to keep that gender representation as is, knowing that I can't explain it? Like, I can't add stuff here to like put everything in the proper context so they understand this guy isn't an asshole. He's just part of the system, right?
Right. Like the only way to do that would be to like create some like space and like just explain right there in the text. Hey, by the way, just so you know, this wouldn't be considered misogynistic or sexist in this culture, just so you're aware. Like, you can't do that in a novel.
No, you can't.
No. Although you can do something, and I'd like to get to it.
Oh, good.
Sure.
Yeah. But for the specific case of this representation, there are some things I left and some things I just very slightly toned down. And the decision there comes from, like, I left the fact that there's this office girl that he's pushing around, and the fact that he doesn't really appreciate the female police officer. Those are important parts of that dynamic, right?
Yeah.
But some of the words and some of the language that they use, you adjust a little bit to make it very clear that this guy is part of a certain culture. And I mean, I could go into like the actual word choice and stuff, but like the intent here, whether I succeeded or not, is represent as truthfully as possible the exchange and the relationships between them without confusing the reader.
Right. I think this is really important, because I think a lot of people would jump to the assumption there that you find what you're reading in Japanese objectionable and are therefore correcting it. Whereas the real intention is, this is going to be distracting for a Western audience. They're going to look at that and raise an eyebrow, and they're not supposed to do that. Yeah.
And I've talked to writers. I didn't talk to Higashina specifically. He's notoriously private. Okay. But I've talked to enough Japanese writers to know when a writer wants to make a point about misogyny in the culture, and when a writer just wants to tell you a good yarn. And in this case, and especially in the case of like Higashina's books, which are these procedural murder mysteries, it's all about the story. And he's, if you ask those, and I'm assuming this, but if you ask some of these authors and you're like, hey, is your intent here to show like Japanese culture to the world, or to tell a great murder mystery? they'd be like, murder mystery, what? Like
Yeah.
what did you say? Like that's not even on the radar, right?
Yeah.
They're just showing things as they are. And so, what do you do? So here's an example, and I sent you guys I think a screenshot of this, so you can maybe post it.
Okay.
Or just
put it on the screen.
The kotatsu. It's at the very bottom of that document I sent you.
Okay.
This is from that first novel. There is, and this is a bit spoilery. So if anyone hasn't read The Devotion of Suspect X, you should read it.
Okay.
I'm only spoiling something that happens at the top of like chapter 2, so it's not. This is like a deep spoiler. But there's a thing in Japan called a kotatsu. You familiar with kotatsu?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah,
Can you describe?
In Japan, they do a couple of things. It's funny the way that different cultures decide to like warm up their home. But because a lot of Japanese people live in, maybe taller buildings, especially in places like Tokyo, or for lots of reasons, they will often not have like a fireplace. Kind of. They have these heated rugs that will warm your feet. So they don't have heat blowing in like we would maybe, from a central like heater, air conditioning or whatever. Right. They'll have a heated rug, and they also have these tables. It's like a coffee table. But in Japan, people often will sit on the floor. Like if you have people over, you sit down on the floor on a low table. They don't. Well, it's not that they don't have chairs. They have chairs, but often they like to, or because of a small cramped area, they will just have a little cushion on the ground and you just sit on the floor or on a tatami mat or something. And in the winter, it can get very cold, right? And so one of the ways to preserve heat, but not just like a budget way to preserve heat, would be to have a coffee table, put a blanket over it, and have a heater under the table. And that way the blanket kind of keeps everything in, and then people kind of crowd in and put their feet underneath the table, and then you can get your toes nice and warm and toasty while you're eating rice or whatever. It's different the way that they go about approaching like heating up a house in the wintertime versus how we do it in the United States. But the kotatsu is like a coffee table with a heater. The heater is actually up. It's on the table itself, but kind of on the bottom. It's got a little cage around it, and then you would have a blanket. I don't know. Sometimes they would be built with a blanket around it because these are special made. But you could also just put your own blanket. You can do it however you'd want to.
Sure.
Yeah, but the idea is it's a budget way to preserve heat for a small space and a small family.
Got it.
Bravo, that was great. And just to like FYI, the classic kotatsu, the way that the blanket works is kind of genius.
Yeah,
you've got the frame of the table with the heating element on it, like you described. The blanket goes over that frame. Yeah. And then a tabletop goes on top of that.
That's right, like a glass or what. It doesn't have to be glass, but often it would be
often wood or whatever.
Yeah, wood usually, but then and that kind of holds everything in place, right?
Yeah. It holds the blanket in place unless you like play cards or really importantly eat mikan, the mandarin oranges.
I don't think I've ever had one.
When it's New Year's, you have to sit around the kotatsu. You have to watch Kohaku Utagassen, which is like this battling of the bands thing that's on TV, and you have to eat mandarin oranges. And I say this not to say, hey, I know Japanese culture, but to allude to the fact that actually there's a lot more about the kotatsu. You introduced all the best parts. There's actually more.
Ooh, yes.
And normally, none of this matters. If there's a kotatsu in a scene, you can say it's a table. Right. But what if you're in a situation where it matters that it's low to the floor?
Right.
It matters that it has this blanket over it. It matters that there's a heating element. It matters that modern kotatsu are connected to a wall plug.
Yeah.
With a braided electrical cord. This is a cord that has an insulating braided sort of sheath around it.
Okay.
And that's how it's plugged in. That matters in this scenario. Also matters that the kotatsu is always in the middle of your tatami room.
Yes.
It occupies the middle of that space. The TV's off to the side. You all like get under the kotatsu. Kotatsu are great, by the way. It's like the best way to have a nap. Oh my gosh. The room's cold. You get in Zago. It's so nice. And cats love it. It's the best.
Oh yes, that is that. Cats love it.
Yeah. None of that is actually important for this story, but the chord is important, and the fact that it lives in the middle of the room. So in chapter 2, I think, of this book, abusive ex-husband comes to an apartment, is murdered by his ex-wife. Somebody comes and knocks on the door. They don't have a whole lot of time to move the body. So the body's lying off to the side because the guy had sat down at the kotatsu before he was killed. The body's lying off to the side. They push the kotatsu over the body so it's up against the side of the wall.
Yes.
And a detective walks in.
And something's out of place.
That's a lot of cultural context you need to understand to know what's going through the investigator's mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. And then later on, they're like, okay, hey, we found this body discarded like way over here. What's this mark around his neck? Oh, he was strangled.
It's braided.
It's braided. The lacerations.
I see where this
braided.
is going. Yeah.
And I'm here translating this, and I'm like, oh my God.
You have to add stuff in.
I have to add stuff, right? Okay, so this is a great example. Here is a completely invented moment in chapter 2, where Togashi is the ex-husband, and he's visiting the apartment for the first time and last time. He says, "Little small, little old, but not a bad place," Togashi commented as he sat down on the floor, tucking his legs underneath the heated kotatsu table in the middle of the room. "Hey, your kotatsu's off," he grumbled, fumbling around for the cord and switching it on. He mentioned in the original that it was a little small and a little old, but not a bad place. He does sit down at the kotatsu. That's how they get the jump on him. All of that rest of that dialogue is added.
Yeah.
Right.
And then, was this the best job I could have done? I don't know. I hope. It's there at least. And if you get to the end and you read about the cord around the neck, you can go back and read this and go, oh, okay, yeah, that's how it worked. And that's why the cop was like, something was off. The kotatsu was up against the side of the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's got the blanket so you can hide a body under it. Like, you got to know everything. It's insane.
What I like about this translation here is that you didn't describe it overbearingly, but you did, and I think as few words as possible, because you say he sat down on the floor, so that gives you an idea of what this is. Yep. Then he tucked his legs underneath the heated kotatsu, right?
Yes.
Which is like, okay, great. Tucked, that implies that there's a blanket, right?
Yes.
But without saying, by the way, this thing has a blanket and it's complicated and whatever, he tucked his legs, he's on the floor, he's tucking himself underneath a heated kotatsu. Anyways, it gives you the information that you need, in the center of the room, without necessarily kind of overbearingly the way I would, like kind of explain the whole thing and be like, look, guys, look.
Well, and then also
in
mentioning the cord, it's an electrical heating.
Yes, and switching it on.
I was about to commend you for the same thing. You said all of that so briefly.
Yeah.
That's the most impressive part about it.
Yeah, it's just in few words.
Yeah.
So
there was more blanket stuff and more like kotatsu positioning stuff
elsewhere
that was tweaked later on.
Gotcha.
For sure. But that's one of the like, it's a good example, I think, of the stuff that you absolutely have to change. And it's entirely in service of the original and in service of not confusing the
audience,
the reader.
Yeah.
There are other things now that I would change more of because Devotion Suspect actually got sold in Walmart.
Oh, really? Huh.
First time that any book or game I'd worked on. It's happened since then, but had gotten sold at such a wide audience.
Yeah.
So you get a lot of people who are reading these things who is maybe the first book they've even read in translation, or first Japanese book. And it was a eye-opening experience because I would see comments on Goodreads and stuff like Yoko, Yasuko. I couldn't tell them apart.
Yes.
And
the names. Yeah.
And in my head, I'm like, oh, totally different names.
Yeah.
But then like reset to 17-year-old me, like learning Japanese for the first time. It's the same name.
You know what? Kind of funny story. When I first watched Lord of the Rings, I actually got Sauron and Saruman confused.
Oh, yeah.
Because their names are just a little too close.
Yeah.
And it works. It's like, general bad guy.
Yeah, I talked about this a lot in our Final Fantasy Tactics deep dive.
Yeah.
It wasn't, I guess there were some characters' names like this, but it was mostly like the regions. They had 2 regions next to each other with almost the exact same names.
I remember
with
that,
like a Z, a word that began with a Z and ended with a T, and then like this neighboring region had almost exactly the same. And so we were just talking generally about, especially for these like really complex political fantasy stories where there are so many names, so many different like places, place names, things like that you have to remember. One courtesy you can give as a writer to your audience is to just make them very different sounding names so that they can remember what's what.
Sometimes it's hard to think about that, but
yeah, it's really important, I feel like.
I'm a big advocate for nicknames now.
Interesting.
Because you don't want to change, and sometimes names are really important and you don't change them.
Right. If they mean something.
Yeah, it's also on the table. Like a lot of stuff is on the table when you're bringing, and it depends on your market. Like if you're selling it's a literary work, you know, a Murakami or whatever, and you're bringing that to a literary audience, you're going to expect something of that audience. And I think this actually kind of dovetails nicely, and we need to get back to like the main point.
Yes,
here.
we do.
Yes.
Good. Of like the complaints that were raised against this. It's like, you know, who's the audience? What kind of translation do they want? How can you make everyone happy? You can't make everyone happy is the answer there, but like how can you create something that's going to please the, you know, kind of fit the needs of most people, and where is the room to like create a second thing, and how do we have that conversation? And let me just kind of jump down through some of this stuff. This is a really quick side note, and it kind of gets back to something Kason was talking about K-dramas.
Oh yeah, yep.
Where there's this Netflix effect, where all the stuff on Netflix that's being watched in Korea is being watched by Korean developers or, you know, writers, and they're like, I want to do something like that, and I want to sell something to Netflix. So they create something that's more homogenized, and you start losing whatever that K-drama was.
It's so funny because as Korean culture has gotten more and more popular through music and TV, I have like started dropping off. Like I'm actually not into it as much anymore. But it's reaching peak popularity because it's becoming more Americanized. But that's turning me off as a purist, you know, whatever.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and that's a totally valid like take on it, right? There's a intellectual fallacy, is that the right word? This idea of not to quote anyone, but like make JRPGs great again kind of deal.
No, you couldn't possibly be quoting anyone.
No, I don't know. So where's my hat? The issue here is like, what are we talking about? When were they great? When were K-dramas great?
When I was 14 is when JRPGs were great, and everyone has the same answer. It's when I was 14.
Yeah, we've talked about this a lot in the past too. Yeah. There's a certain period of time in your teens generally, that sort of a junior high school, maybe getting into college age,
whatever you
where
like.
You're actually forming more memories than at any other point in your life.
Yeah.
It's just like those sort of like, you know, impactful sort of formative years are where you're going to develop all of your tastes and that's just where you're going to go for when things were great, is to those times. Yeah.
I'll fast forward through some of the thinking here, but everything is part of this dialogue, you know, between cultures, between creators. And as they become closer together, you get sort of this cultural homogeneity. And there are other people, look up David Marks is a writer y'all should read, about this sort of cultural back and forth. There's a ton to talk about there. And it's ongoing, and no one can stop it because it's not like individuals doing this. These are like massive cultural shifts, and for better or for worse. Just some really good news.
Let's hear it.
Well, actually, no. A little historical note, like JRPGs, they only exist because like Dungeons and Dragons was invented.
So they're pretty intrinsically tied to the West to begin with.
Yeah, like where did it start? Like, you know, how far back do we need to go to get like this pure, unadulterated Japan? And actually, Japan does kind of have an answer for that, like the Edo period, because they were closed off from the rest of the world.
Right.
Yeah, but lots of times it's very hard to like draw the line of where
Right.
the conversation began and where it's going. I invite everyone to join in that conversation. And there's some really good news. And this is maybe a way forward for people who don't like the way that Japanese works are getting into the West now,
Right.
like very specifically. And the good news is there is a ton of stuff that hasn't been translated yet. Old stuff where the devs didn't give a crap about what the US thought.
Nice.
Like, advocate, yeah, sure, but maybe make a little company. Find somebody who knows the devs, and people are doing this too. It's not like it's not like my idea. Go and find the games you really like, and hire translators who will do it the way you like, and then find that audience. That's adding to the conversation in a very constructive way, and it's meeting. If you want to draw your line of battle somewhere, draw it at localization. You're meeting localization on its turf, and you're saying, look, here's an alternative. Let's talk about that.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And
then
oh, sorry. I was just going to say, this is something we had talked about and I had briefly mentioned to you, as far as like shifting the mindset of how do you like market this particular idea of like quote unquote, like faithful translation, right?
Yeah.
Like, and market that to a group and try to determine how large that audience is or whatever, right? Like you could be a part of creating that entire like marketing trend if you were to do this, right? You could go back to something, get the rights to it, do the work, and market it that way. This is like a culturally accurate, faithful as possible translation. And build a reputation for yourself as your company for doing this. And then you would, just as Alex was mentioning, you would have creators coming to you because of your approach to translation.
Right, if you get a lot of people, that's
and
true.
sort of making a wave, making a movement in that direction.
Yeah.
That would be, I think, the best way that you could go about making a change if that's what you think is necessary in this industry, right?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I think anything that adds to the conversation, anything that yes ands the conversation is always going to get you more mileage than no.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah. And there's so much in this world that saying no to is not effective.
Yeah.
And I mean, I went through this too. Like there is also a certain stage in your life when no is the easiest answer. And then it becomes yes. And then it becomes, I don't know, but
yes,
that's sort of, it's part of this journey that
a
lot of us are still on. I mean, we're all on, I think. And, this actually gets back to a point that was raised specifically by Zago about the dry translation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Where he didn't want people to think that the dry translations he offers as a example of how localization has changed are meant to be a replacement for that, or meant to be a final product. It's just like, this is a technical exercise to show that, with the understanding that's really hard to make that understood in a tweet storm.
Sure.
My reaction to that would be like, thank you for putting the effort, especially like learning Japanese. Like, that's huge. And we need that. The one like tough love note that I'd have here is that you can't have it both ways.
Yeah.
You need to show a way forward in order to be added to the conversation. And just pointing out where something has gone wrong isn't pushing that forward. And I know that it's hard, Twitter's hard, actually. Basically, you need to be in this kind of format. You need to be talking face to face.
Yeah.
To put that stuff forward. I know that's not possible for everybody, but
for everybody.
That is one thing I like to point out, that the conversation can quickly go off the rails when everyone isn't operating on the same playing field.
Yeah.
And that might be a good segue into talking about correcting the narrative.
Yeah,
let's go there.
I want to do that, but right before you do that, I want to say one thing about. I agree wholeheartedly with what you're saying. it is a lot easier, and this is true of every industry where there's critics. It's a lot easier to point out what has gone wrong than to suggest this is how it should have been done or how I would have done it, because now you're opening yourself up to the same kind of criticism of your interpretation, right?
Yeah.
So maybe this is something, again, I'm asking Zagos or others who do this on Twitter to consider rhetorically. I'm not demanding that you give an answer, but my question to you is, like, would you consider, as you're doing your write-ups and showing your comparisons, adding, this is how I think you can get this across more accurately and in a way that reads correctly in English, that would work as an English line?
And while you're at it, also learn some programming and make your own fan translation. Just while you're doing it, you may as well just like create a little patch that like people can download and then.
Sure. I mean, like, obviously there's some limits to the amount of work that can go into or what people have time for, but at least
just translate the whole game while you're at it.
least, you know, if you're going to be so sharp in your criticism, so like intense about it, open up yourself a little bit to be on an even playing field with those people doing that work.
Be like, I submit saying, this one.
This is how I would have done it, and see what people say to that.
Yeah.
And if maybe you're threading that needle better, and maybe, like we're saying, that's then pushing the conversation forward. You're giving an example. Is that fair to say?
That's totally fair. And I think that there's another side to this, which I'm going to get into, and this is more of the sort of tough love, and like it's extending an arm, really, a hand, and saying, hey, you know, the conversation's going on over here. Please join us. And
nice.
It might sound a little bit like I do want to get into the weeds here. We've still got a little time.
I mean, if you,
because I feel like what happened with some of the early criticism, and I'm not that long ago, but you know, April, of games like the Euden and then the
Unicorn
Overlord before that, is that there was this, both games like extremely well received.
Yeah.
And lots of accolades, you know, a million copies for Unicorn. That's insane.
Yeah.
Like, that's,
for that type of game.
That game sold really well.
That's awesome.
For what it is.
Like, right?
Congrats, dude. That's so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Really well received, really well written, you know, when you kind of read it like face value, like these are great games. And then there was this backlash from part of the, you know, community that was like, you've changed the translations.
Yeah.
Right.
And then you see the shift in the dialogue where like everyone's like, this is a great game. It's like, it's a lot of fun. The writing's great. Like, I love it. Oh, but there's some problems with the translation. And then, like, you know, a week later, people are like, it was a great game except for that problem. And nobody's looking into it.
Right.
And everyone's taking it at face value. And they're like, yeah, no, I guess there was a problem because enough people said it, and we're all like, we're accepting all this face value. So I'm not here to say like you're wrong, to point out, and I hope that everything we talked about up to this point is evidence enough that like this is an ongoing discussion. But I do think there is value in pointing out and like actually looking at some of that older criticism, even if we've all moved on from it, to rectify to some degree the narrative about these games.
I would love that.
About localization. And this won't be the last disclaimer, probably, but just as a disclaimer, like, I'm not here to score points or like defend my localization bros, and I'm really not here to play gotcha. This is about understanding like the level of discourse and also some like really basic things, like this is how much Japanese you need to know, you know, to have a discussion about Japanese.
We often refer to the Dunning-Kruger scale. So the idea is that when you first start learning something, you feel like you know a lot, and then your confidence in what you know starts to actually go down the more you learn. So the more you learn, the less you realize you actually know on the whole landscape of what there is to know. And that typically people only ever reach that point of having confidence in the thing that they first started researching years ago, kind of towards the end of their career, basically.
Yeah.
Like towards the end, once they've been doing this for decades. I think a lot of times, like when I first learned Japanese and I watched like a Studio Ghibli movie with Japanese audio and English subtitles, and this is simple, basic Japanese stuff. This is like early level stuff, but somebody answered yes when the subtitle said no. And I was like, those are opposites. Like in English, you would say, don't you want to like go outside? No, I'd rather stay in. Well, in Japanese, if you ask, don't you want to go outside? They'd say, yes, I want to stay. Yes, I don't. Like, because you ask, do not you, don't you?
Yes.
And they would say, yeah, I don't want to go outside. Right? They would answer yes instead of no. Anyway, it's almost like hi doesn't necessarily mean yes. It means more like agree, like I agree.
It means correct.
Yeah, something like that. But when I first started learning Japanese, and that was like the first mistake I had ever caught in my life in Japanese, of me thinking like, wait, I know the word for yes, and that wasn't it.
Yeah.
Or I know the word for no, or whatever it is. They screwed up. They did the wrong thing, right? Then the more you learn, the more it's like, oh, that's how it works. And I was actually translated perfectly fine. But the Dunning-Kruger kind of, I think it has a lot to do with what we're seeing right now from a lot of people who maybe don't have as much experience with the language as the people who've been doing it for a really long time. Maybe people who've lived there, people who have made a career out of this.
Yeah.
That's
Well, along those lines, then, Alex, how much Japanese would you say a person needs to have to do this kind of work, and why do they need to have that much experience?
And why do they need to know another language too?
Right. You've got a preview. Because we had this discussion a little while ago offline. I get this question a lot, and it's usually framed from people who want to get into localization. And they're very, very concerned about their, JLPT level?
Yes, yeah, N5, N4, N1.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'm an M4, do I need to be a blah, blah, blah? I actually don't know what the numbers are. I never took the test.
It starts at 5, it goes down to 1, and then...
One's the most proficient.
One is the most
proficient.
proficient. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. I've never taken the test.
You never did?
It just wasn't. It wasn't a thing back in the day.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. I mean, maybe it existed, but it certainly wasn't. I also was coming from a PhD program in classical Japanese literature.
Right, so you probably didn't have
into
to.
translating video games, and they're like, you speak Japanese. Although in my interview, actually, the president of Squaresoft interviewed me. Yeah. This is my first day there. Wow. I had no idea who he was. Nice. And he came in speaking Japanese, like really fast and hard, and said, he's like, okay, so yeah, you're this dude. You maybe lived in Japan for a few years. You got a Japanese girlfriend. You speak a little Japanese. Like that, it basically. And I was like, half of me is like, did you read my resume? And the other half of me is like, who are you? And then the other half of me, I have 3 halves in this.
Very nice voice. Yeah.
Was like, holy shit, this guy's intimidating. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. Oh my god, that just total like freak out. And then I just had to like slowly say, no. Like I did spend some time in Japan. I don't have a Japanese girlfriend. I was in a program learning about classical Japanese literature. And he's like, oh, like what? And I just started rattling off, Ujisui Monogatari, Konjaku Monogatari, Setsuo Bungaku, and complete blank, as you should get from somebody who's not like studying 800. This is 800 AD, 900 AD stuff.
That's the early stuff, man. Woo.
Yeah. And he's like, oh, okay. And he, and he walks out. And I'm like, I don't know what just happened, but I'm already traumatized. and I did get the job, but so my answer is not you have to study classical Japanese, although it doesn't hurt. And that's one of the points here is breadth is really, really important.
Okay.
And if I was going to put a specific limiter on it, or a specific place where like if you've crossed this line you're okay, it would have to do with an awareness of Japanese as it is spoken and written to the degree that you could write something in Japanese and have a hope of fooling somebody that you were a native speaker. And And that's just maybe a way to test the heart of this, which is you have to be able to expect what a Japanese writer is going to say or want to say in any given scenario in order to understand when they are not saying it. So if you read something and you take it at face value, you can decipher it. And that's where you start with any language learning. Right. You start with this idea, and Japanese is notorious among everything. I've studied several languages myself. I'm terrible at all of them, but the Japanese, because Japanese was so big that I had to spend all my time there. Right. And it is notorious. I mean, the biggest thing that I've had to face, and that everyone else doing this has to face, is you do like 4 years of Japanese in undergrad. And you know all the words, you know how to use a dictionary, you know what I mean, people don't use dictionaries somewhere, whatever. And you sit down and you read something and you're like, I know what all these words mean. I have no idea what they're saying.
I have experienced that so many times. It's the most frustrating part of learning any language.
So frustrating.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
At some point, you just need to be exposed to it raw enough times to where your brain just kind of snaps into how their grammar works.
Yeah, but it's even, I mean, yes, it is grammar, but it's also the cultural context.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And the question of why does a Japanese person say this at this time rather than that?
Yeah.
And you get to this idea of this is something else I had a note on somewhere. Oh yeah. This is another example from the Higashino book.
Okay.
And it gets to one of the questions that we were talking about offline, where you guys asked me, like, what do you do with untranslatables?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was like, I disagree that there's such a thing as an untranslatable. But here's what you do when you hit something that doesn't seem to work directly. And there's a classic example, the word natsukashi.
Yeah, natsukashi.
Nostalgic, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you can see in the thing kind of down the pitfalls of direct translation.
Yeah.
And you're welcome to like post this stuff on the screen in the edit if you like to. But there's this little phrase here, and I wrote it out. What you want to read the Yasuko wa Marugiwa ni tatte?
Yeah, in Japanese or in English?
Japanese.
Yeah.
First.
Yasuko wa Marugiwa ni tatte yake o mite ita. Koko natsukashi ne.
Right.
Yeah.
So can you give me a direct translation of
that? Yeah. So as for Yasuko, he stood near the window. He was looking at the outside, and then he said, "Here is," and then natsukashi. Now, this is such an interesting word, but the word basically means nostalgic. So he says, "This nostalgic, huh?"
Yeah, exactly. Right. So that's great. Yasuko's a woman, but it's fine. There's a lot of other.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No. That only bothered me. So, and that was a great direct translation. Yasuko stood by the edge of the window, looking out at the night scenery, and said, "Here, this is very nostalgic, isn't it?" Right? Is your sort of direct translation.
Yeah.
Clearly, this is this is a novel, right? You're not going to have a woman standing by, and you need context too. So this is a bit of an unfair thing to say, like, hey, translate this, because you need to know that she's standing talking to this guy that they used to date. Now they're not talking. Now they're not talking anymore, but they've gotten together again after many years, and they're at a place where they actually went on a date. And in Japanese,
yes, that's very valuable.
All of that is in here.
Yeah.
She's standing by the window. She's looking out at the night sky, and she's saying, "Wow, this is really nostalgic," right?
Yeah.
English doesn't work like this.
No.
English, first of all, does a lot more work with its verbs than Japanese does. So she's not standing by the window side. She's maybe leaning against the window. She's lingering by the window. There's all kinds of words we can use here.
Gotcha.
To get across the feelings that she's having.
Yeah.
Standing is not descriptive enough.
Exactly. And English needs to be descriptive. It needs to be. It's a low context language. It needs to spell it out in that sense. And it feels weird if it's not specific. And no word gets us across better than a word like natsukashi, which you'll hear all the time in Japanese, and it literally means this is nostalgic. No one in English says this is nostalgic. So what do they say? Do you have any ideas now that you know this scenario here? Like, what could she say instead of saying Koko Natsukashi ne?
Koko Natsukashi, this would be, it reminds me of the time where blank. Or, I haven't felt this way since in the past 5 years. I haven't, something like that.
Yeah. Everything leads to a specific example.
It's very rare for somebody to look out and to just say, well, maybe brings back old times. That might be brings back old times. That might be a quicker, more succinct way to say something similar.
Yeah.
So indeed, that's what I used.
Oh, is it?
Translation is like, this really brings me back.
Yeah. Nice. Direct. Sorry, you don't know. Do you have a direct one here?
I
That's right.
I didn't. Sorry. So yeah, I'm really cheating. I didn't put that thing. I did use like, this really brings me back, but I actually left the official translation out on purpose because I wanted you to explore.
Very nice.
And which you did a fantastic job. Thank you. And because the whole point here is that Japanese and English work very differently. And you can say, hey, I'm bringing this Japanese right over to the English. And she says, this is nostalgic. And we've taken all the air out of the scene. Nothing's working the way it works. We have to make a decision. That decision is almost always more specificity, is more better in English. How do we get specific? We pull from some other place. I know that they were there 5 years ago. So I'll say, wow, remember 5 years ago?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Or whatever, whatever the thing is. Do you make it up? Probably not, especially not in a murder mystery, right?
Yeah.
Because that there lies dragons. Like, you don't want to make that kind of mistake.
Right.
So sometimes you have to play the safe and narrow and say something like, this really brings me back, which is acceptable in English, but is a little vapid for the scene. And it doesn't quite hit the way that in Japanese, Koko Natsukashi ne is like, like, oh my God, she's acknowledging that old relationship. She's not fighting him. Are they going to get back together? Like, there's so much going on there.
Yeah.
And this is nostalgic in English is like, flatline, right?
Yeah.
And so this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about when if you approach this and say, hey, the direct translation here is that she was standing by the window and that she was saying it was nostalgic.
Yeah. Something's
gone wrong. If that's your premise when you go into this, you're not playing with all the tools here. And I think that what moves the conversation forward is to force yourself to think about it like a localizer. And that means I'm not just deciphering the Japanese. I'm thinking about my audience. I'm thinking about getting this point across. And then, like, somebody could, we just went over like 5 different ways of translating this, and we didn't even go into the verbs. Like, there's a lot of right answers here.
No,
there's a lot of right answers, and some of those right answers are going to be more acceptable to some people than others.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what, if you just read this and say, Yasuku stood by the window, looked out at the scenery, and said, "This is nostalgic," that's not the kind of book that gets sold in Walmart. We'll just put it that way. The 10,000 stores across the country. You do, if you want people to read it, you do have to make it, you have to localize it in a way that people can actually like connect with it. Not just technically understand the words and then do the meeting halfway in Japanese, but to really connect with it.
The language needs to be something that, people are captured by.
Yeah.
The language, needs to be captivating in and of itself. And at least as far as I have seen in every, like, quote unquote direct translation, that's not the case. The language is not captivating at all.
Right.
And I know that Zakogdo has made that caveat, so I'm not trying to retread ground there, that this would not be this would not be the final product when I give this very dry, direct translation. But that's what I'm saying is, why don't you try that exercise of making that language work and sing and be captivating in English?
Yeah.
And then see whether all of your purist bros agree with you.
See if they still like you after that.
Yeah. Right? Like that's the
kinda
harder
funny.
part.
Oh, that is way harder. You know what? I have noticed that like often if I'll be watching a show or in, any language at this point, and I'll be watching with my wife, and if it's in a foreign language, often I will make the note or a brief quip, or I will just bring up like, oh, that's not actually what he said there, or actually what they said was actually this. But not in an upset tone, but just like, oh, that's interesting. Well, I wonder why they did that. Oh, that's fascinating. That's not what they actually said here. I wonder why. Because every now and then my wife will be like, what, did they get it wrong? I was like, oh, no, they didn't get it wrong. It's just she technically said something else. And I'm curious. I'm interested in that.
Yeah.
Why did they do that?
Why did they make that choice?
And it is fun, though. It's actually fun when you first learn a language to be able to notice that it's not one-to-one. It's not direct, right? There's something fun about that. Like when I told you that first time I watched a Ghibli movie when I was like 13, and I was like, that wasn't the right Japanese. That was like kind of fun. Like it made me feel good. It made me like, whoa, I am learning Japanese enough to differentiate. Like it was kind of cool. It was a confidence booster. And like there's something fun about it. But you can take that and then get mad and say you translate it wrong, and it's like, no, you don't know Japanese the way these people do. Or you can ask the question like, oh, I wonder why they translated yes as no. That's interesting. That fascinates me. I wonder why they did that, and seek to understand it instead of just immediately jumping to the, well, aren't they stupid? Yes always mean yes can't mean no. Like that doesn't make sense.
This is exactly like my feeling on things, and part of why I let off last episode the way I did.
Yeah.
Like, let's try to train ourselves as much as possible not to make assumptions about why people do what they do, and let's just actually open the door and talk to them. And you might learn there's a lot, like, this has been fascinating hearing about these audio clips have to have the same number of that just like blew my freaking mind into a million pieces. Like, gosh, like I said, vicarious freaking like stress. That's crazy. And you don't know that when you're just consuming the game and looking at the differences.
Right.
Like that's important context to have before I think you can be as heavy-handed in your criticism as some people are. Like I said, it's a lot easier to make the criticism, point out what's wrong, than to actually get in and do the work and see all the problems that arise that you have to solve.
Right, yeah.
Right? And so why not ask first, get all that context, then your criticism can be far more informed and you can push the conversation forward. Is kind of really my whole point in being here, even though I don't speak Japanese and have nothing to add on that side of things, right?
It's just fun to know a language enough to recognize when there's a discrepancy at all. And that it's a confidence booster. And you can show off to your friends or wife.
Sure.
As it may be. And say, I know what they really said. They really said such and such and such and such. But what you do with that is what makes all the difference, in my opinion. Whether or not you're going to use that as a hammer and go after the people, or whether or not you're going to just kind of, keep that question in your mind and then seek understanding later. Is I think the difference.
Right. So I think it's important at this point to jump into the criticism on Eiyuden Chronicle. So I actually kickstarted this game. I was one of the people that back when it was on Kickstarter. I was very excited for it. I actually did a text interview with Murayama, the creator of Suikoden, who founded Rabbit and Bear Studio that made this game. And it was supposed to be kind of like a Suikoden-like kind of game, right? And so it was him sort of returning after many, many years of not being a part of the Suikoden series to make something like Suikoden. So there was a lot of buzz about this. I think it was the highest Kickstarter, maybe not ever on the whole platform, but as far as games go. Like it made the most money on Kickstarter of any video game that's ever been Kickstarted.
Wow.
So there was a lot of people, a lot of buzz, a lot of excitement about this game. And so I was surprised to see sort of this vehement reaction to the script. I hadn't had time to play it yet.
Yeah, I haven't either. That may be
So I downloaded it while I was in Europe.
Oh, cool.
Last month. And started playing through it a little bit so I could at least see some of these examples. And I think a lot of the criticism that Sakagdo laid is towards the beginning of the game. Most of it that he had in his thread, I've played through now and I've seen in context.
Okay.
So we're going to go through some of those examples, and talk about what level of accuracy is this really, like, and anyway, Alex, I think, has done a good job of like giving a kind of a rating on accuracy. And what was the other aspect you were kind of giving a rating to? It was accuracy and something else, wasn't it?
Respectfulness.
Respectfulness. That's what it was. Yeah.
Nice.
So we want to kind of go through that.
Yeah. And this is a direct response to an old post by Zagos about Eowyn Chronicles, but it kind of kicked off this, the storm about these things. And I understand, like, this is again, not gotcha. And I'm also not like relitigating stuff that's already been litigated. This is, I hopefully adding something new to the conversation and to the understanding of what's going on in localization in general, and then specifically in this case.
Yeah.
But thanks for that introduction. I think that was, it gets us all on the same page. I actually learned some stuff there too. As is my want, when talking about someone else's translation, I like to start by talking about my translation.
Of course.
And of course, I mean, why are we here? And there's an example when I was reading some of the Eowyn critique, and it also, like, it's just, full disclosure, when I started hearing about this, and I might have mentioned this in the first episode too, like, I didn't know who translated it. Like, I still don't know. Like, I know that Brian was involved, but there's actually, there's other people involved, and it's never, we've already gone over this, right? It takes a village, et cetera. It's a team, right? So I can't even say like, Brian did this or Brian did do this, like, and that's not the point. When I was first looking at it and I read the criticism, I, like everyone else who read it, much to Zagos' surprise, thought, oh, maybe somebody messed up. Maybe the translation was bad somehow. That was my first, I should know better. Like, if anyone in the world like is going to talk about game translation and make really quick assumptions, like, I should be the last person to make quick assumptions, because I've seen so much of this going on, and it's happened to me, and whatever. So that was really dumb, but that's like an example of sort of human nature. Like, I was right along with that whole narrative of like, it's a great game. Problems with the localization. It's a great game, but there's problems with the localization. Like, I was like right along with that, right? And so, and I got other stuff going on, so I didn't read into it. But because you reached out to Zagos and he replied, and I actually went and I started reading through the stuff, and I thought, oh my gosh, there are some bad takes here. Completely unintentional, but there's actually room for me to share some some thoughts about this, and that's sort of the spirit that I'm approaching this in. Like, not gotcha, but like jump on board. Let's go through this together. Maybe next time, like, you reach out and I'll go through it with you in advance. Like, I can't promise that for everybody, but that's sort of like, that's the spirit that I'm approaching this in. So let's rewind the clock back to my early 20s, when JRPGs were great, and playing or translating actually the first like full game that I kind of did, that I was the lead translator on, was Vagrant Story. And helped immensely by many other people, and and this is again a great example, like Rich Amtower, who's currently and has been at Nintendo forever. Since then, he was an editor at Squaresoft, and has a degree in Middle English. So this is like
nice.
That's awesome.
Love that stuff.
And we like completely nerded out about etymologies and Germanic roots versus Latin roots. And,
that's so much fun.
We were having a blast, and this is also context. I just came out of academia at this point too, so that's where I was coming into it, and I had never played a JRPG.
Oh wow, this was the first one that you
had
worked
with
on.
One exception, you played FF7 to prepare for the interview.
Oh, okay, nice.
Yeah, but that was the first thing I played, and I saw that and I was like, I could do this. But that's a whole other conversation. So anyways, Vagrant Story, I'm going to drill down to a really specific thing, and please share the screenshots later in the edit or, in the notes.
Yeah, I was so pleased when I saw that you had chosen this example, because it was the exact same example I used to talk about the translation in my Vagrant Story retrospective that I did years ago. It's one of my favorite examples of the game about the differences and why I like the English script so much. So.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, no, that's a complete happenstance and cool. I like that.
Yeah. Super huge coincidence, but I was so glad you picked exactly the same one. Exactly the same lines, same text boxes, everything.
Yeah. So just to set the scene, Vagrant Story is this it's set in this sort of faux medieval world, obviously made by a Japanese dev team led by Matsuno Yasumi and Yasumi Matsuno in the West. Right. And there's a scene here with two knights. They're sort of like middle, lower class knights. And they have, for the first time, seen something operating by magic in the world. It was this floating stone. I think we called them cloud stones or something. It's like a platforming game where you have to jump on the stone and move around or push the boxes onto it, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so they see this stone floating in the air, and their minds are blown. Because this is a low magic world, and they're not used to that stuff. And they have a conversation. And so one of the guys turns to the other, and in Japanese, he says, "Sonna kantan ni tsukaru mono nano ka, mahou te yatsu wa?" And then the other guy responds. I won't even read it all in Japanese, but I'll directly translate what they say. The first guy says, "Is it really that easy to use this magic stuff?" And the second guy says, "If you believe the historians, there were these things called grimoires that let anyone use it." So what's the information here? First guy is saying, what's up with this magic? You know more about magic than I do. We just saw something really cool. What's up with this? Is it really that easy to use? Could we do this? And the other guy's like, hey, we could if we had grimoires. So that's all the information here. Now, how does the official English translation approach this? The first guy says, "Swine will take wing, for the likes of us use magic, my friend." And his response is, the other guy's response is, "Aye, but with a grimoire, your fattest sow could outfly my swiftest falcon, if you believe the chroniclers." So what this is doing is it's taking all the information from the original exchange, and it's couching it in what some people might call flowery language, this sort of elevated faux medieval tone. And just to be clear, this is not Shakespearean. That
right.
They're very different beasts. This is much closer to Game of Thrones than and Lord of the Rings. Than it is to anything actually medieval. That's just the way that English works. But the idea here is that they are saying the same stuff, but they're using idioms, and there's wordplay. There's this idea of and maybe Matt, Mike, you can add your own thoughts on this too, because you've dealt with this example as well. But it's using a bunch of different things here to accomplish the same.
Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that strikes me the most about it, and this is kind of what I talked about in the last episode. This is just somewhere where I philosophically disagree with Zagos. He recognizes that and respects that.
Yeah.
But for me, I really like the language to reflect the setting, right? I don't want to be reading, as I put it, TikTok language in a medieval world.
Right.
That's going to bring me right out and just be like, whoa, this is just too weird.
Yeah.
So one thing, and I know that you said this is not Shakespearean, but it has echoes of that. I think that's what writers like George Martin and Tolkien are maybe informed by, though they are obviously not using the these and the thous and the exact early modern English parlance. They're sort of echoing it a little bit to just give it that feel.
Yeah, exactly.
While making it a little bit more readable for modern audiences than something like the King James Bible or Shakespeare would be, right? So it's not that and I'm glad you made that distinction. But one literary device that Shakespeare used a lot was the use of something called conceits. Yeah. And this is where you have one character using a metaphor to make their point. In this case, we're using the pig, the
pig
swine,
flying,
right, as the metaphor, right? And then the other character will sort of like take that metaphor and do a really clever flipping of the table or a different perspective on that same exact metaphor to make their counterpoint.
Right.
Which is just a very clever use of the language to have some banter back and forth that you can really add a lot of great flavor to the dialogue and make it very captivating and interesting to listen to or to read. And so this is why I love Vagrant Stories dialogue so much, is because it utilizes those types of literary devices which were much more common in older forms of English, even though today we still have them, and I'm sure you'll comment on that too. English is still very much this way, but it just comes across as being so clever and it just flows so well. And so I was all over this. I love this language in this dialogue for that reason. I think that's what you were kind of alluding for me to kind of take there.
And like a side point here is that English is a very historically aware language.
Yeah.
It knows where it came from and to some extent where it's going.
Yeah.
And it values that usage of old phrasings in a way that not all languages do. And one of those is Japanese, where it's much more comfortable moving to like, this is how we speak now, this is how we're going to use it. And if these guys in Japanese, like, you know, a criticism you might say about this is like, well, that Japanese there, the, you know, like, that's pretty straightforward Japanese. These people aren't talking like Japanese people in the 1800s or the 1500s. And that's because,
and in particular, like the word yatsu, it's like, it's just not, it doesn't seem to be particularly evocative of like some ancient formal way of speaking. If you don't know the word yatsu, it can refer to people or things, but it's usually, it's kind of like a ruder way to refer to things. But.
Yeah, exactly. And the point I'm trying to make here is that English is historically aware of where it came from, and it feels weird if you ignore the past. Like you said, TikTok language. It feels weird in certain situations if you're not, if you're not incorporating that stuff and that wordplay and the idea of conceits. And Vagrant Story has leitmotifs in it. That's a whole nother. Like a lot of stuff. There's rhythms. There's like, iambic pentameter. That kind of stuff. And those are things that it's not just options in English. It's stuff that if English doesn't have, it feels like it's lacking something.
Right.
It wants to go there. Right.
Naturally,
and that's an important concept to keep in. I think that's especially important with talking about Unicorn Overlord. But the like specifically here with this, you could look at the Japanese and say it's totally normal. But they wouldn't be talking like, first of all, there were no medieval knights in Japan. The closest cognate we can get to is samurai.
Right.
If these guys were talking like samurai, it would be a total dissonance.
Because clearly you look at this knight, this is not a samurai.
No.
This is a
exactly.
This is a European medieval knight.
Right. So if then, if you take this too far and you're like, well, maybe the original Japanese wasn't very well written. Like it's not using, it's not characterizing these characters very well. That's not the case. This is doing exactly the job it's supposed to do here. And it fits and it works. And then so the goal of we're doing equivalent experiences is to find what that, what the words are in English that work here. And there's a term that I should also probably throw in there, which is called voice. And this is something, it's very hard to define, but you know it when it's there and you know when it's missing. And I'm not talking about like a character's voice, although that's also very important in this kind of dialogue scenario, but the voice of the writer, like what's the world that they're inviting you into? And this is something, if you pick up a novel written by an amateur and it doesn't have voice, you don't even get through the first page.
Right. There's less coherence to the whole thing. In fact, you could even almost use the word spirit interchangeably with voice, right? There's no unifying the thematic stuff is missing, or like, where is this going, right? You should be leading that trail throughout the whole work, not just kind of at the end, oh, that's where we were going, right? It should be kind of woven in.
Woven all throughout.
It's the authorial voice. And it's something that we think about a lot, or we realize, we sense a lot without thinking about it very much. And that's one of the first things that you lose when you start translating something. It's
the spirit, the voice.
I'd say it's almost impossible to take a source voice and just bring it directly into the target voice.
Yes. I actually I wrote this text note down last week as we were about to record the episode, and my note said translation is impossible because I've been thinking about this for so long, and I finally have come to the point where it's just like, you know what? Then this is maybe why I'm not so hard on, or maybe why I'm not so critical of translators or hard on when I'm like, oh, I wouldn't have done that or that didn't line up, is because of that one phrase right there. Translation is impossible. I've kind of come to that point where it's like true translation is so hard. You just either get closer to it or further from it, but you can never actually get it.
Yeah, and there was one comment that I saw. And again, I'm not trying to punch down at this person or anything, but again, just sort of like maybe gently make you aware of a world you might not be aware of. I had said something like, the more I learn about this, the more complex this issue becomes.
Yeah.
And the response was, "What are you talking about? This is the simplest thing ever. Just translate what's there."
Yeah.
And my response to that is, if this hasn't become clear already at this point in the conversation, you cannot do that.
Yeah.
And the reason you think you can do that is because you have not learned a foreign language before.
Yes.
Anyone who has learned a foreign language, even me, to the very low amount that I know of Portuguese, certainly not fluent yet. I can read pretty well. I can barely understand when people talk to me. But I know this. I know that you cannot just translate what's there. It just doesn't work. It's not possible.
It's an ignorant statement, but it's a type of ignorance that you can kind of forgive because you just have to experience it to know it. There's no way to impart that knowledge to somebody else.
Yes.
You just have to experience it, and most people will never go through that experience of learning a second language. I say most people. No, most people in America will not go through the experience of learning a second language, like truly. And it is what it is, and not everyone has to. And some people are just going to think in their mind, their monolingual mind, that just, what are you talking about? Just translate what's there. And that's most people. You can't expect everybody to be able to get to this point in something as optional in America as learning a second language.
Yeah. But I'll just say to this person, sorry, I don't remember the username. I challenge you to try to learn a foreign language if you really believe that.
It will only take 10,000 hours, and I promise you, it's worth it.
Also, you will not think this after you've done it.
You will not.
Anyway, pass it back over to Alex at this point.
Let's so having done that Vagrant Story bit, let's jump into Euden. Yeah, and this is, I'm referring to an old post from Zagos, so apologies to him for like dredging this up, but in the interest of sort of like correcting this narrative, so, and this is an interesting one because there's layers to this one too. So this is the first example, and this is from a screenshot that Zagos provided. Sorry, can you hear that helicopter?
Only barely.
Is that what that is?
It's just barely.
Yeah, you're good.
You're good.
Barely. Okay, great. Yeah. That's, if you want to talk about colonization, that's the U.S. space.
Oh, very interesting. Next time.
Yeah. What are you talking about? Yeah. So this is a scene with a character named Leon, who is talking about lenses in this game, which are sort of like this artifact that you can use to evoke magic. Feel free to correct me in the comments.
No, that's basically right. That's basically
right.
Yeah.
Okay. And in the original English translation, she says, "You've got a lens, Noah?" And then Leon says, "Well, ladies and gentle wolves, so do I." There's some wolves involved.
Yeah. There's a wolf. There's a wolf character in the party, so that's why she says that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. And then she says this line: "Rub-a-dub-dub, don't be a flub." And as she's doing this, she's rubbing the lens in an attempt to evoke this magic. And then she says, "There, did you see the glint?" And just for interests of representation, I'll read the direct translation, which, as we all know by now, is it's a start, but it's not enough. Do the work, learn the language, and then actually try to produce something, please. Anyway, sorry.
Yes.
Weird disclaimer. Here's the direct translation. Oh, you've got a lens too, Noah? That's the same. You've got a lens, Noah? Oh, you've got a lens too, Noah? And then Leon says, "Hehe, and I?" And then she says, "Hora, dero, dero, dero," in Japanese, which you could translate it as like, look here, come out. And then she's like, ne, ima chotto dake mieta desho? And she's like, there, you can see it from home, right? So there's a couple things to say about this before we even get to the meme part of it.
Yes.
Which is fascinating to me because I learned this live, talking to you guys that this was the thing. But the idea here, and this is why I brought up the vagrant story example. You know what you need to accomplish in this scene as the translator. You have to show the character evoking magic using an invocation, something that reads as an invocation in English in order to sell the scene.
Right.
And one way that English loves to do that is by using rhymes. And her line, rub-a-dub-dub, don't be a flub, not only works as an invocation just on face value, better than say the come out, which is it's almost nonsensical actually. Maybe with the right context it would work, but it's hard. It's not quite there.
Well, I think is in inviting the light to come out or something, like glint, like, oh, come on.
Yeah, I guess. It needs a little work. It needs a little workshop.
Gotcha.
Like maybe there's definitely an alternative here. But if I think about like where would I go with this, and then I look at this translation, I don't know if I ever would have gotten to rub-a-dub-dub, don't be a flub. Yeah. But one thing that this is doing that I definitely want to call out is great is it's referencing her rubbing the lens. Right. Just like those guys in Vagrant's story had seen the cloud drifting, and all of the language they use is about flying pigs and falcons, pigs outflying falcons. And they're all referencing something in the game. It's inspired by the game, and it's adding that important context to the moment.
Right.
And I think that's really important to kind of understand what the original translation is trying to do. And then to the meme part, did somebody want to speak to the meme?
Yeah, so why don't I do that real quick? This time I've actually pulled up my conversation with Zakogdo and in the private messages on X. So I'll read his words here, but I think an important part of the context for this and why people were kind of up in arms about it is that apparently there's a meme among like people who get really into this like Japanese localization comparison and criticism and stuff, where there was a certain game. He doesn't mention what the game is, but what he says here is if you haven't heard of it, rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub, is a sort of meme phrase that gets thrown around in discussions about localization as a translation of, I can't say this right, but
itadakimasu.
Itadakimasu.
Yeah. Itadakimasu.
Do you want to talk about what that means real quick in the Japanese culture?
Itadakimasu. Itadakimasu is something that Japanese people will say before they eat a meal. It's very common. It's deeply, deeply ingrained in the culture. It's a polite thing to do, as well as this is just what we say. It's akin to something like a prayer. In fact, it's something like a very short prayer that Japanese people will say when they're given food. And technically, if you're going to translate it directly, it means humbly I receive, or something along those lines. And when translators come across the line itadakimasu in media being localized to the West, they usually don't do that. They usually pick something else, like yum, let's eat, or looks good, thank you, let's chow down, or something like that. Oh, I'm hungry, sometimes they'll say. But what's really being said is itadakimasu. It's been translated a billion different ways, and I guess this rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub, is one of the decisions that
somebody made
to translate. And now we don't know what it is, so I don't even know enough to say that was a wrong translation. But typically that's treating it a little, I don't know, because often when people say itadakimasu, they are treating it lightly. You have to say the nice formal things in Japanese, but often people will just kind of say it quickly, just as a just to get it over with.
Culturally, historically, this is like an act of humility before a meal.
Yes,
the same way, maybe not the same way. I shouldn't say same, but similar to how culturally in Christian countries you say grace.
Yeah, it's like saying grace.
Of course, it's not a long prayer like that. They're not Christians. There's all these other
lots of caveats. but it's being humble before
being grateful,
the necessity of being grateful for food,
expressing gratitude for this meal.
Yeah.
So there's a humility involved in that. However, when this becomes a part of your everyday life, there are going to be instances where you're just saying it to say it.
Yes.
You're not actually showing that gratitude or humility. And so that's where maybe sometimes they don't translate it in a way that shows deference or reverence or something. They're saying something more like, hey, let's eat. Because that is actually closer, because they're just saying the thing to get it over with so that they can eat.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah,
so I don't
explanation.
know the context behind the game where it was translated. It does sound very funny given
Rub-a-dub-dub. If it's Ernie in Sesame Street with his rubber ducky at the kitchen dinner table, like, rub-a-dub-dub.
Thanks for the grub.
Mr. Ducky, thanks for the grub. I could see Ernie saying that and having that be a correct localization choice. I doubt that that's really where this came from, though.
Yeah, or maybe if it's a child who, and I see this in a lot of JRPGs, like I forget the character in Xenogears, the little kid who looks like a 50-year-old man who's like super rude all the time. What's his freaking
remember
name?
him, but I can't remember.
Anyway, he's like talks about his sister in a super rude way.
Yeah.
So he's like a really rude kid. You see that archetype in a lot of JRPGs. Little kids who they talk in ways that are not polite or whatever.
Right.
So maybe that was the case. I don't know. But the point is, this became a meme. This rub-a-dub-dub, thanks for the grub, to mean humbly I receive is the direct translation.
So people who are deeply involved in the translation missteps world on Twitter will see a line that also says rub-a-dub-dub and will assume, oh, they're referencing the meme that we hate. They're making fun of us.
Yes.
How dare they, right?
Exactly,
and getting really
what
upset and
happened
worked
here.
up. And it's like, wait. Rub-a-dub-dub, I have heard that maybe 1,000 times in my life. It's not that common, but it's common enough to where, like, I have heard
you
that
don't have to
phrase
just jump to the assumption that it's a reference to this meme
to that one
necessarily.
thing.
But that's what they're doing. They're assuming that this was an intentional reference to this meme to almost mock people who want
like, haha, in your face. You didn't like rub-a-dub-dub? Here, I did it again, and you have to play the game.
Yeah, right.
And not just once, but like 3 times, or in the game.
Yes, exactly.
It's reused.
Yeah. So, anyways, that's the context behind rub-a-dub-dub in this example.
But interesting enough, though, rub-a-dub-dub being used as an incantation. If I'm going to think of like one of the kind of, you talk about the history of the English language, one of the source, like backbone source materials for incantations in general is Shakespeare. And is it Macbeth with the 3 sisters, the 3 witches, and their incantation is something like double dub dub, right? Double double toil and trouble, fire gleam and cauldron bubble, right? They're telling a rhyme that kind of sounds silly, really.
Sure.
Double toil and trouble. Like, what does that even mean? Okay, cauldron. Now, at least in the second verse, they're referencing what's actually happening. Everything else before that was just like a roses are red, violets are blue. Just whatever you say to make the rhyme later.
This is true in a lot of fairy tale stories, or maybe like older fantasy stuff before it got all grimdark in the modern age. There was a lot of silly type of incantations.
Yes,
strange
absolutely.
words.
In fact,
abracadabra.
Yes, but abracadabra. Okay, let me go through this real quick, you guys. This is fascinating stuff. Abracadabra comes from the first few words of the Bible. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, just really quick side thing. All I'm getting from this is that the original translation of Euden is more Shakespearean in a way that's what I'm getting. Please continue.
Totally true.
It's not just that like English can do this. It's like English has to do this.
Yes.
If English isn't referencing its past, it feels like it's not firing on all cylinders. However many cylinders the English engine has.
7. Let's do an odd number.
Thank God you knew. Okay. Let me just quickly go through some of the other things. So I feel like we're at this point. Oh, wait, no, it's worth noting here that so when I first became aware of this and then learned that this was actually a meme, the rub-a-dub thing, my immediate reaction was like, this is not referencing that meme. Right, and I only know that because I translated a bazillion things and I know how this works. And I have referenced localization memes.
Oh, have you? No way.
So I am oddly qualified to speak on this.
Wow.
But I'm gonna put that aside for just a second to mention that I did reach out to Brian
Okay.
Yeah.
Suspecting that this was not a reference to the meme, I reached out to him and said, hey, like when you translated this, which I love, by the way, did you, were you referencing the meme? And he's like, no, I heard about it later, you know,
right.
the thing, which I knew was going to be the answer, but I just wanted to like, you know,
The
get that out
official,
there.
the
Like,
air there. Yeah.
there's zero, the agenda here is like, let's make the best game we possibly can because we love the game.
Right.
And we want to, that's the agenda. Like, you know, guilty as charged if that's the critique.
Sure.
And that was also what drove me to reference a localization meme in, I think, every Final Fantasy I worked on, with permission, mostly. And that is, every Final Fantasy I worked on contains the phrase Spoony Bard.
Oh, really?
Right. Yep. And that is mostly permissible because Final Fantasy fans love Spoony Bard.
It's so beloved. Yeah.
So they're okay.
It's fan
with
service. It is fan service. Absolutely.
Very nice.
I did it for you guys. It's like absolutely for fans, but also I did it for me. I don't know if you can see.
Oh, what's that?
This is
that
sorry.
the Spoony Bard?
Oh yeah. That's
bad on this.
Yeah.
This is a cross stitch that my daughter made for me on
Oh,
one of my
nice.
birthdays.
Oh, that's so cool.
And I belong to a guild called the Spoony Bards, and it gets, you know.
Yeah, that's
huge shout out to Ted Woolsey. Who's a friend.
Have you I was about to ask if you had met him. Yeah.
Yeah, Joe Reeder of Kaja Productions and I gave a talk at PAX Prime.
Very cool.
Now.
Yeah.
Back in like 2009, I think. And Ted was there, and we had lunch, and it was great. It also turns out that, you know, lo and behold, we're connected through like several other people. He was in academia for a long time, so I have all these connections with him through that side of things.
Nice
too. So great guy, and obviously like one of the OGs.
Yes, he is. He is the godfather of RPG translation.
The Spoony Bards, which I challenge you to find because they're hidden very, very well.
I don't know that I've ever seen it other than that one game.
Then in FF4, which is where it comes from.
Yeah, but other than FF4, I don't think I've ever seen it.
I guarantee there's one in FF10 and there's one in FF12.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I kind of know where FF10 is. I definitely know where FF12 is.
We're going to be looking for that when we do FF12 now. We're going to scour the world to find it.
Good luck. It is buried so deep, man.
Really? Oh, jeez.
Yeah. Anyway. So yeah, there's the gauntlet. Do what you want with it. Really, really quickly moving on here to another thing, which is a hot take, and I totally get where it came from. But also it needs to get explicated. And when we were talking about this offline, Kaysen, you actually had a really good way of describing it. So I'll set you up and then let you go. But the phrase here is there's a part where this character Noah and Mio are fighting against this sort of animated golem, and Noah says, "Got him." And this is the original translation. Mio says, "You sure it's a he?" And the Japanese, Noah says, "Yatta zo," which is basically like, "We did it."
Yeah.
And Mio says, "Sukashi kono dekabutsu nanda," and which is like, "But what is this huge thing anyway?" And just in terms of like setup, like English, Japanese is much more comfortable with stating the obvious than English is.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel as expository in Japanese. There's a lot of Japanese is actually, you know, you spend a lot of time saying "so desu ne."
Yes.
Which is best just saying, "Yep, that's the way it is."
Right. Yeah.
And the function of that, to be really reductive here, the function of that is to not add to the conversation. It's to not, I'm not adding any information to the conversation. I'm just acknowledging that we now at this point share this shared context. And I'm just saying, this is the way we all agree up to here. And now we can keep moving on, that kind of thing. It's like that's all it means, really. Japanese is very, very happy with doing this. And so like having a character saying, "Sukashi kono dekabutsu nanda," like, what is this big ass thing, is totally normal. And it reminds me of lines in, there was this game, I forget what the game was that I was translating, but this guy, I was editing this game actually, and a guy comes up on the rooftop, you know, it's this like Schwarzenegger kind of guy or whatever. And he was expecting a chopper lift. And the helicopter explodes in the air. And his line when he sees the helicopter explode is "Heriga," which is like
the helicopter,
like the helicopter, the chopper, basically. And you can say that in English, but it's like really dumb. And which isn't to say that Japanese is dumb. It's just the languages work very differently. So that's like the prelude to this.
This is something that I noticed. That actually, it actually hurt my reading of Xenogears the first time I played Xenogears because there's so much what is called Aizuchi in Xenogears, and that's where a person is just more or less acknowledging or like actively listening. They're just showing that they understand you, but they'll sort of repeat what you just said back to you in the form of a question.
Yeah.
It's not like they don't do this at all in English. We do it sometimes.
Yeah.
But not nearly as much as in Japanese.
They let you know that they're listening.
Yes.
Often.
Yeah.
That is the purpose
so
of doing it.
Yeah.
Right? And this is actually true in Metal Gear Solid as well. Like a lot of people have memed on Metal Gear Solid because some character will say something about Metal Gear and then Snake, Metal Gear? He just repeats the same thing back.
Or the one, you thought of a funny one too. This was years ago when we did this, but having the person just say the other character's name.
Yes.
Just, Michael.
Yes, right. Like we were talking about this. Like
we don't do that.
You're having like a heartfelt moment, like a heart-to-heart talk. And this happens all the time in anime and Japanese games.
Oh, and they're crying.
And it's become normal for people who consume a lot of that.
Yeah.
But it is so weird if we were in a real conversation. We're like having this heartfelt moment and we're talking back and forth and I like bare my heart out to you. And then you just pause and go, Mike. It just sounds ridiculous. Right? It sounds absolutely ridiculous in English.
Oh my gosh.
But they translate that faithfully, you would maybe call that, in anime all the time.
Yeah.
And maybe to Zakogdo's argument, if you're inundated with that enough, it becomes normal to you as an anime watcher and you expect it. Yeah. And now you've learned a certain part of the Japanese culture, and that's fascinating.
Which is great.
When I learned about Aizuchi on my second Xenogears playthrough, I went, oh, that's what's going on. I don't see Faye as an idiot anymore. Right? I considered that character just an absolute moron because he couldn't understand what anyone was saying. It's just like, dude, why do you keep... What are you not getting?
Every sentence people said, he would then pose a question to it. And it was like, are you really not understanding this?
I want to maybe as a concession to Zagogdo's point about like you need to do some work to understand the culture of the source language. I enjoy that I have been able to do that and learn more about it.
Yes.
But at the same time, the English is just, it doesn't read well.
Right,
and that's not a slight on Richard Honeywood. He's a great translator and did so much work, as you've alluded to, Alex, to like put in...
Metal Gear?
No. About
this is Xenogears.
Xenogears.
Okay.
Yeah, Richard Honeywood did Xenogears, and he put in those systems, those structural systems we've been talking about, to make localization better at Square ever after that. But it just reads really badly in English, really badly, and it's funny and hilarious. And you're not supposed to be laughing at it. You're not supposed to be laughing. My father? Do you mean my dad? right? Like that line is terrible in English. It's awful.
I love it.
But like, all this other context. So anyways, I think that there's an element of that maybe going on here where stating the obvious or something like that is more or less just making everyone understand around you. We're all on the same page. That's the purpose that line serves in Japanese. We don't have that, where we don't do that same thing in English, right? So how do you translate that?
Right.
In a way that makes sense in English without saying really silly things like, my father, do you mean my dad? And have everyone laugh at the line. Right?
Aizuchi literally means like a matching hammer blow. And it has to do with when you're making, it's when you're like pounding mochi rice or when you're making a sword together, like one person hits and then the other person hits. And that idea of like the matching blow.
Oh, that's cool. I love that.
Yeah, that's how Japanese conversation works.
Yeah.
And I was introduced to this. I knew about it from speaking a little Japanese, but one of my favorite memories of Aizuchi, or like realizing how weird Aizuchi can be, is I had a professor in undergrad who was American. He had grown up in Japan as the son of missionaries, and his first language was Japanese, even though he's a white dude.
Yeah.
And when I went in for office hours to talk to him, and as I'm talking, he kept going, "Oh, I see. well, I see. Oh, yes. Well, I see. And I was like, dude, I know you see. Like, I felt like the Weird Al stitched interview with Eminem.
Yeah.
Where he
have seen
has
it.
Eminem say, I don't know if you've seen this is forever
No.
ago, but Eminem's like, you know what I mean? You know what I mean? And Weird Al's like, yeah, I know what you mean.
Yes.
And he just like keeps repeating that. And you see
Yes.
obviously like putting it together. But it felt like
That's
that.
funny.
And I was like, what the hell's going on with this dude? And then as I left, I was like, oh my God, that was Aizuchi in English.
Yes.
Wow.
You know, he was just acknowledging. And once I learned that, I was like, oh, I love this. I'll give him Aizuchi too.
There
And I
you
have
go,
friends
yeah.
who've lived here so long that they do Aizuchi in English.
Yeah.
And it's creating this like third space, which is an interesting topic of conversation. And you know, maybe we have to put it on the shelf for another day. But that's like if you grew up on Pokemon dubs, early Pokemon dubs, and you're used to this whole like weird middle space anime world, maybe there's a market for that. And maybe if you make translations aimed at that market, people will like that. I don't think it's using English the best way it can be used. And I also question whether that, you know, how many people that middle ground is going to appeal to. It wouldn't appeal to me because I'm just doing the Japanese, but it would have appealed to me when I was learning Japanese.
Exactly. Yeah. Me too.
Right? Like the first 4 years even. And in fact, there was a thing called Manga Gene, which I'm sure I mentioned in our first thing, where that magazine that like broke down manga and it gave direct translates.
Right.
Yeah. And it had gosh, it probably would have more traction now than ever, I think, if it
I wish
got resurrected.
Hey, it's a business idea for somebody out there. Make Manga Gene.
Pick it up.
So there's room for that too. All of that said, oh man, and you remind guys, this is terrible. You also reminded me of like FF10, the constant grunts and stuff like that.
Yes, anime grunts.
Yeah, and
it
took us forever, you know. Even and you're also saying like Richard Honeywood and like Xenogears, like it's not his fault that people were doing Aizuchi because that's what they do in the Japanese. And in FF10, we had people saying stuff like they got to say something, right? You've got the file, you got to do something.
Yep.
And so FF10, it took. I don't even think FF10-2 we realized this, but FF12 we realized, oh no, insert a blank where that person says something.
There you go.
It's silent, and sometimes they move the mouth, and sometimes they don't. It's fine. It's better if they don't.
They are breathing.
Yeah, and then sometimes you can actually have somebody with their closed mouth saying something, so you can kind of cheat that too. And we started learning all these little tricks and that sort of thing. Anyway, all of that said, what's going on here, and the critique here is when Noah says got him and Mio says you sure it's a he, the critique is, did you just assume the golem's gender?
Yeah
And I totally see why you get there from if you bring this sort of awareness of the American like gender pronoun situation today, where this is like a big deal right now for many good reasons. And but now looking at this in the context of this Japanese game, I think what the translator was doing, I know what the translator was doing, was saying, when you got him, it's like, we got the person. That's the same as we did it. You could use either one. But that's setting up this rhetorical question of Mio saying, you sure it's a he? And what Mio is asking here is not, does this robot have male genitalia? Or, right. Or like, what's the gender of this robot? It has nothing to do with that. The question is this an inanimate object, a robot that we just killed? Or did this thing have a soul? Was it a person? Is it not he meaning gender he, but he meaning a person?
Yeah.
Right.
I would maybe phrase that more as, is this a he or is it an it?
Right.
Right.
Yep,
like this
it's
is
a pile of rocks.
A pile of rocks that was animated. You're calling it a he, but it's a way again of sort of phrasing a question. What is this thing that we just fought?
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Which was what the original line was, right? Like, what is this giant thing? It's just a way of playing word play, which is what English likes to do, off of what Noah said, got him, to make the insinuation, are you even sure what it is you just fought?
Right. Yeah,
Not a totally non sequitur, like poking at him about gender assumptions in the Western context in which we are all sort of like talking about in the modern age.
Yeah. So she wasn't like shaming him.
No.
She was genuinely like curious about
are you sure?
What the thing was that they just fought.
Yeah.
So he's celebrating and she's like, the first rule before celebrating is to at least know what you just did. Like, what did we just do? What did we just kill? Don't celebrate yet. Like, we don't even know what this thing even is or was, or are there more of them or any of that? You know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, perfect. That's exactly what's going on here. And you can see this and critique it and say, hey, maybe there's a different way to translate this. And I think as a translator now, like if I had this exact same situation, I might anticipate that somebody's going to read gender issues into this thing that don't belong there at all.
Yeah,
and maybe
but
I
I've
would
seen
find
this
some other way
line in like movies, and I've heard like you call it a. Well, maybe not. Maybe not. I feel like I've heard this before, but
I feel like
can't
Aliens might have
think-
something along those
Okay,
lines.
okay.
You know,
Yeah.
like,
That's probably a good
it
example.
doesn't, but it totally could.
But it could, and it feels like maybe it should have.
Well,
If
they
it
do
didn't, it
gender
should've.
her because she happens to be a she. I mean, the alien, at least in the first thing, you know. So there's that.
Yeah.
But
Right. Births new aliens. So yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, but that's neither here nor there. Like that's not what's going on in this
Right,
translation. And I just wanted to make sure that people knew that, because I think it tends to lead off in these directions of like, oh, activist translators, like wokeism, wokelators, you know, that kind of
right.
Yeah.
completely distracting conversation that brings in a lot of other people that also have zero idea what's going on.
Yeah.
And that's a powder keg.
Yeah, and then just jumping
totally.
on a bandwagon and getting upset without like you did, reaching out to the guy directly and just asking what happened.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Like asking is a great way to approach this.
Yeah.
And you guys did this in the last podcast too, or you know, at least that was the stated intent is to ask questions.
Yeah,
you know, we're not here to tell y'all what it is. I'm here to like inform and like, you know, hopefully make the conversations as informative as possible so you see all the sides, but also like ask those questions. Like and the question for me is like, what's another way to do this now that we all know that this can be misread? Like, yeah, like we could talk about other ways to do it.
Yeah, sure.
That's fine.
In fact,
we do that all the time.
given the backlash, it's probably important to
Yes,
do it
maybe
another way
just
to not make this a distraction in the first place.
patch the game or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I never would have thought that from that line unless somebody pointed it out who was specifically looking for it.
Yeah.
Without going into the details of this, there was another point that was made in that long-going thread about the use of swears in Japanese.
Yeah.
And that's all like context. There, you know, one point that's made in the thread is like this character is using the word teme. It's a very rude way of saying you. The best way to translate this is to say something like fuck in English.
Yeah.
Without going into all the details, I'd say be really careful with swears. And it's not that Japanese doesn't have swears. As I mentioned earlier, there are words you're not allowed to say anymore. The Hoso Kinshi Bakuwa, there's a list of them. There are even words that are not on that because they're so bad
that they can't even
they can't even list it. Like they're like, I'm not going to list this because I don't want people to hear this. Like so there are swears in Japanese. Hime is not one of them, but in context it could be. So that's the point of the critic here, where you know you see somebody like acting all rude and stuff, and maybe I will go into a little bit of the examples here. But like this is a character named Francesca. This is also an Euden. And the line in Japanese is like, "Ikagen ni shiro yo teme, kono kitenai tsura boku boku ni suru zo, boke ga," and which directly translates to like, if you think she's swearing, it directly translates to like, "Give it a fucking rest already. I'll bash your disgusting face and dumbass." However, nothing that she said in that is something that you couldn't hear a third grader on a school ground say. And not only that, but I'm sure there's lots of third graders that use the F word. But not only that, like a teacher would not bat an eye at that. It's not swearing. Maybe they're being rude. If they're hitting somebody over the head while they say it, they're going to stop that. But the language itself is not problematic. And so when you read that Japanese in this context, like if Francesca was a Yakuza and she was threatening to kill another Yakuza, I would totally expect some F-bombs in the English translation.
But if she's a 10-year-old girl.
Yeah, exactly. And a spirited girl. So what did the English translation do? Get your grimy hand away from me, scumbag. You want me to chop off your fingers and start shoving them up where the sun don't shine, huh? Like, that's attitude. It's crass. It's not swearing, because if there were swears in there, suddenly this is a very different character.
Yeah.
This is no longer like schoolyard acceptable. And yeah, it's a decision. But I think the translator here made a good decision. And to say like they're censoring swears from that were there in the Japanese because they were afraid of reception or whatever is looking at this from the wrong direction.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I
Cool.
want to mention this too. It has been confirmed at this point that Murayama, creator of the game, reached out to Brian and this group of translators and picked them the same way that you were mentioning earlier, because they were aware of their work and wanted to work with them and worked closely with them.
Yep.
So there's a lot of
Totally makes
assumptions being made here that, again, rogue translation, and not taking into account that they sat down and had conversations about this. And so, again, what we're here to do, I would hope is clear after how many hours we've been talking about this now, is to do nothing other than dispel assumptions. A lot of people are jumping to assumptions, and maybe you could say it's because they have very little faith right now. There's been bad, there's been a lot of what they feel are dismissals of their concerns.
Yeah.
And this has been going on for a long time, and so maybe there's a lot of anger there, and that anger is pushing them to make assumptions and not have a lot of faith in things. But I would argue that your arguments are happening with like other people on the internet that are maybe defending the industry that are maybe not inside of it. I doubt very much that there are a lot of like currently working translators out there in Twitter wars with people about like localization.
If
and stuff
they are,
like that.
they're anonymous.
Due to NDAs, due
Yeah.
to not wanting to, I mean, you don't go out and like pick fights with people when you belong to an organization, or else you're putting a bad image on the brand and the organization.
This is true.
So-
Even if you're defending the organization, it's like you did not have permission to speak. There's media training that people typically undergo
Yes.
when they're going to be a spokesperson for the official release of the game. There's
Right.
millions of dollars at stake here. They don't want every single one of the 100 people who made this game to all go out there and just start talking about their experience making it. Even if they're saying positive things, maybe there's problems with the way that they said it or something. There's reasons why companies will say, you do not have permission to talk about this game at all right now.
Yes.
And even into the future, you don't want to speak for other people because, well, you don't know who you're going to be working with in the future, what other game opportunities are going to come for you in the future. And like we said, translators don't get paid that well. So they aren't likely the ones who are going to be out there, taking a bunch of risk on behalf of, the game that they publish for NDA reasons and for future work reasons.
Right. So this is another thing about being aware of who you're actually mad at. Who are the
Right.
people who have been dismissing you for years? Is it really...
I have a theory about
Is
this.
it actually these people who are doing the work? And maybe there are. Maybe I'm unaware of that. And if so, reach out to me and show me the receipts. Show me the examples. But it seems to me that people are fighting with each other. This has escalated like to a really toxic level. And now that toxicity, your anger, your resentment of feeling dismissed is now carrying over to making these assumptions about these translators and their assumed wokeness, like making its way into the decisions they make. And we wanted to at least point at some concrete examples where that assumption could be easily made if you are the person that's in this mindset and upset already.
Yeah.
Whereas you're not considering other explanations from people who are not in the weeds of this culture war with you online every day, who aren't thinking about it like that, and who might put a line in like, "Are you sure it's a he?" and have absolutely zero intention of making that about gender assumption and culture war stuff.
Right.
It was actually something totally different. But you give no room to make that clarification, and you're all jumping on this on an assumption, and it is purely an assumption. And that has been the number one priority of me jumping into this in the first place.
Yeah.
And again, encouraging. This is why we reached out to Alex. This is why we reached out to Zakogdo. This is why we're going to continue to reach out to anybody else who wants to talk about this so that we can clarify what people actually feel and think and not just make assumptions about it and then jump on a bandwagon and start mudslinging, because that doesn't get you anywhere, and it really won't help the movement that you're trying to push forward, which I think all of us, and I don't want to speak for you, Alex, but you have seen that maybe there is some room, maybe there is a audience here, maybe there are some changes that could be made to the process, putting in a system, right, that can address some of these concerns. And I think that would be a good thing, and everyone would agree to that, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's a conversation to be had there for sure.
Yeah.
And especially if people are approaching it in a constructive way and getting informed and watching the videos and and paying attention, and actually so being part of the discussion, as opposed to standing outside in the garden and lobbing rocks over the wall.
Right. Well, I feel pretty pleased with what we've covered here. Was there anything else that you wanted to say, Alex, that we didn't get around to, that you wanted to touch on or clarify?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay.
And I'd be amazed if anyone is actually still listening.
Yeah.
So I guess we can say whatever we want.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Let's
At this point.
I mean, thanks again for being willing to go on this ridiculous deep dive into some of this stuff. It's amazing. As we talk about this, I have a whole list of things that I've been writing notes as we go through, things that I remembered, solutions that we came up with for all of these different little problems. We're all doing this, and I think I can speak for localization in general here. We're all doing this because we love the stuff, we love the storytelling, and we want as many people as possible to enjoy the original. What's great about the original, and that's sort of always my guiding light is don't break anything. That's the rule, right? Try not to break something. That's maintain what's great about the original. And then you have all those other considerations to make and all those other decisions, and we're not going to make the right decision every time. That's going to happen. Right. It's amazing that the right decision never gets made.
Yes,
that's how I feel.
Because translation is impossible.
Because translation is impossible.
It's just not a possible thing to do.
Yeah, if that's one thing you leave today knowing, that's good enough.
Yeah.
Gosh.
Well.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
No, I just even translating Middle English or even translating older English to modern English is the words don't even mean the same thing, and they're the same words, right? Anyways.
Yeah. The word gay is a great example.
Yep. Oh, yes.
60, 70 years ago meant a very
not
different
even that
thing
long
than
ago.
now, right?
Yeah.
So, it's always constantly shifting.
Yep.
Anyway, thank you for joining us. It has been an absolute pleasure, a blast speaking with you about all this. I feel like I learned so much.
Me too.
Again, just mind racing with anxiety about the matching frames of how long the audio files need to be. Just unbelievable.
Yeah.
The constraints that are put on this very small group of people not being paid a lot who are sleeping at their desks. Just insane. And I'm glad that we've advanced since then. Hopefully that's not still the way the people are going about doing this at this point.
It's gotten better.
I would certainly hope so.
Next time we talk to Alexander should be less about this controversy and more about the dope stuff that he's done.
That's true.
Throughout his career. Yeah. So hopefully that happens soon.
We'll see when FF12 comes up as voted on Patreon to cover. But we'll reach out again to you for sure for that one, Alex, if you're down.
Sweet.
Okay.
Really enjoyed talking with you guys.
Yeah. Thanks.
Good. Thank you.
And thanks everyone for watching. And, we're like I said, we're not in this to solve this. We don't presume to think we're going to, but hopefully we can at least push it in a direction to whatever degree our little corner of the internet can, into more constructive territory and actually get some answers that will, resolve some people's concerns and move this into a place where we can all be a little bit happier with what we're getting.
Well, we don't want to do a blanket generalization anyways of that it's all good or it's all bad. It's case by case.
Yes.
But at least let these cases let you understand and inform you for many of the future cases you'll see to maybe be a little bit more lenient on some of the translators who are doing a very impossible job.
An impossible job. It's a good note to leave it off on. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again next time. Peace out.